Hold on to your butts.
What's going on, guys? Hope you're all doing well. Now, for today's video, I wanted to give you a comprehensive look at scenes from the Jurassic Park series that never got made, but they were supposed to be made and were even storyboarded, scripted, had even practical effects made for them some of the time, so these are parts of the Jurassic Park lore that never got canonized, but were very close and originally supposed to. Recently, I did a big 1-hour video on official Jurassic Park lore, and that did extremely good. Thank you for all of that, because I've been making videos for over 6 years and I really appreciated the positive feedback on that deep dive. If that video hits 100,000 views, I think I can go over other topics like unused dinosaurs, old scripts, complete gaming long plays, and even more, as long as you guys like it. But for today, I wanted to take a look at the non-canon material in this series that was supposed to be canon. Now, before we go further, I just want to make this very clear. These are not deleted scenes. None of this stuff was actually filmed to my knowledge, but it was supposed to be filmed. These are some of the more cryptic scenes in the series, meaning they were actually supposed to be in the movies, but for whatever reason, they were abandoned and left out of the final canon. Storyboards, concept art, and in some cases entire special effects were created for these scenes. Some of the special effects even wound up in the movies themselves, only in a different capacity. But these actual pieces of the lore never got filmed. And look, guys, this is the stuff that really gets me excited. Now, for the most part, these scenes are going to be in order to how they were originally supposed to appear in the movies, but I had to make an exception for the first one, which is an event that was going to take place towards the end of the Lost World Jurassic Park, because, I'm not even joking, guys, this is, in my opinion, the coolest Jurassic Park scene that never made it into the final movie, and it's one of the most brutal and interesting things that I wish they had adapted for any of the other sequels, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This first scene is from JP2, and then we go into more of a clear timeline with all of the others. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you all enjoy what these movies could have been. This is a list of the unmade lore for the films that was originally deemed canon during production.
Let's get this movable feast underway.
More than anything from the books or comics or older scripts, this exact scene is the single thing that I would absolutely love to see on the big screen in a new Jurassic World movie someday. In this video, I'll be summarizing what happens in the script for you as far as this single scenario goes. There are also two other major action sequences involving pteranodons and velociraptors that happen to be playing out around the same time this takes place. But for now, I'd rather just focus on the suspense scene that was supposed to bookend the villain of the second movie. Now, the major differences in the script begin right around the time the Tyrannosaurs attack the Hunter camp. In this version of the script, Nick Van Owen does not take the bullets out of Roland's gun, and instead a Rex stomps on his tent and pushes the rifle into the mud while the dinosaurs attack the fleeing men. The long grass scene soon takes place after, and the last few survivors meet back up at where their camp had just been trampled. Roland is at the hole in the ground where his tent once was. He's pulled his 600 Nitro Express from the mud and more or less cleaned it, and now he's checking the loads. Kelly, nearly catatonic with fear, clings to Sarah, and it doesn't look as if she'll ever let go. Roland appears standing over the group. He looks at Malcolm, who's found the Lindstrat air rifle. "How many rounds did you find for that?" he asks. And Malcolm responds that he's found 4, counting one in the chamber. Roland tells Ian to not let it out of his hands again, and asks Sarah if Kelly can walk. Sarah tells the hunter to ask Kelly herself. And so he sternly asks while looking down, "Can the kid walk?" Kelly responds that she can. Now it's time for him to take charge. They've got to get off of this island and back to the mainland as soon as possible. We're going to find a path down into the interior of the island. Load up whatever you think you need, and I mean need. If you can't carry it indefinitely, don't bring it. We'll hit the worker village in a couple hours and be out of here before dawn. While everyone is packing up, Roland bends over one of the 3-toed footprints left by the Rex. He sniffs it and finds it's filled with some kind of liquid. Now he takes his canteen, dumps the remaining water into the ground, and plunges it into the footprint. Ludlow hovers over his shoulder. "What is that?" he asks. "Piss," Roland responds. Ludlow doesn't ask. Timbo stares down at the ashes of the cooking fire that led to such a disaster. He grabs a handful of the ash and shoves it into his pants pocket, and the group begins to push on to the worker village. Once arriving, Roland pulls out his canteen, and Ludlow watches as he screws the top off and moves towards the building. Now he begins splashing the contents all around the village. The rest of the group just stares. "What's he got in there?" Malcolm asks. "Piss," Ludlow responds. Nick Van Owen asks what in God's name he would want with it. Now Roland rejoins them. It's Tyrannosaur urine. I don't want anything to do with it, and neither does any other animal on this island. This building is now marked as the Rex's territory. As long as you stay in that building, you'll all be safe until the helicopter comes. He drops his pack, swings his gun off his shoulder, and checks the load. I'm going after the Rex. I saw a fresh kill back in the valley with Tyrannosaur tracks all over. If I'm not back in time, don't wait for me. Sarah asks if he's kidding, and Roland responds that it's against his nature to hole up in a cave and wait. Now Ludlow asks if he thinks the Rex might have the infant with it, and Roland says that it is possible. Now Ludlow takes off his hat and turns to Nick. You know how to work a radio, don't you? Dr. Harding asks if Ludlow's going as well, and he responds that yes, he lost everything he came after on this trip, but one T-Rex and one theme park could single-handedly bail InGen out of Chapter 11. He takes a slip of paper from the brim of his hat and hands it to Nick. This is the broadcast frequency. ID yourself as Harvest Leader. You know what to tell him. Ian Malcolm asks the gentlemen if they feel this is what they have to do right now. And Roland says that it's the perfect time. The animal just fed, so it won't stalk us for food. Predators don't hunt when they're not hungry. He and Ludlow turn and make their way back into the jungle. Back in the Valley of Death, Roland bends down, checking the carcass of the freshly chewed hadrosaur he saw earlier. A set of giant three-toed Rex tracks leads away from the carcass and down the stream bed. Roland follows them, and Ludlow follows Roland. As they near a bend in the stream, Roland looks down at the surface of the water. A pattern of ripples moves towards them. Roland follows the ripples with his eyes. From up ahead around the bend, he can hear the sound of an animal eating and drinking. A very large animal. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a pinch of the ashes from the cooking fire that he scooped up earlier, and releases that on the wind. They float there for a second, suspended, and then blow back at him. We're downwind. Good, Ludlow says. Roland darts a contemptuous look at him. He puts a finger to his lips, gesturing for silence, then steps up onto the shore. Peter follows. Forward towards the sound. Over the rise he sees the Tyrannosaur, about 100 yards ahead. It's stooped over the stream bed, drinking, like a bird. Roland gently flicks the safety on his gun to off. Ludlow edges towards the cover of a low-hanging branch. As he puts his weight on one knee, it presses down hard on the middle of a small stick, which cracks in half. Roland turns, eyes blazing. Out in the open, the Tyrannosaur snaps its head sharply as well, staring in the direction of the sound. But since Roland's own head is turned, he doesn't see the dinosaur's reaction. Roland turns a warning finger to Ludlow, before turning his head back. The Tyrannosaur is gone. Further on, Roland and Ludlow continue to follow the footprints. To the right, the ground gives way to hard black volcanic rock. A short distance behind them, the rock is solid, a massive green pebbled boulder 10 feet high. Roland frowns and whispers in Ludlow's ear again. We took to the rock. Why? Ludlow asks. In front of Roland, a palm tree sways gently in the night breeze. His eyes widen. He pulls out another pinch of campfire ash and releases it in the wind. This time, the ash blows off, straight away from him. Wind shift, he whispers. They freeze, terrified. Behind them, the enormous green pebbled boulder opens an eye. It's the male Tyrannosaur, standing rock solid still, its natural camouflage blending into the surrounding foliage. Very slowly, and almost silently, the Rex brings its head all the way around until it's staring directly down at them from about 10 feet away. Roland and Ludlow stand frozen, their back to the Rex, unaware of its presence, until it exhales. The soft snort of its breath isn't quite audible, but it brushes the hair on their necks ever so slightly. Their hearts drop into their stomachs. Ludlow speaks, his voice a queasy hiss. It's behind us. Roland answers in the softest whisper. It's just fed. It won't attack unless it's threatened. Don't move. As the Rex silently cocks its head, sizing up the danger from the intruders, it breathes again. A few strands of Ludlow's hair flap in the exhalation. He closes his eyes, near tears. He can't take it. His eyes dart, glancing down at the weapon he holds in his hands. Unfortunately, it's extended in front of him, away from the Rex. He risks another hiss. If I don't move, I can't shoot it. Roland responds, let it go, Peter. The animal won. Behind them, the Rex appears satisfied. It starts to swing its massive head around, back toward the jungle. It lifts one great leg and takes a step into the trees. Roland sighs and closes his eyes, relieved. But Ludlow seizes the opportunity. He whips his weapon around and drops to one knee. No! Roland screams. The Rex is infinitely quicker. Ludlow just has time to squeeze off a short burst of semi-automatic gunfire when the animal whirls. It took one elegant step forward and pounced. Ludlow's bullets rip harmlessly through the foliage between the Rex's legs as its big head snaps forward and comes down jaws wide. They close around Ludlow's body, lift him straight up into the air, and toss him once, readjusting their grip so it's firmly around his midsection. The whole combination of movements takes but half a second. By the time Roland turns around, the animal has pivoted and darted back into the jungle, carrying Ludlow, still screaming and writhing in his mouth. Roland raises his gun to draw a bead on the animal, but through the shivering trees, he can only see that the Tyrannosaur is gone. Soon after, Peter Ludlow, still alive, drops through the air and crunches to the muddy ground, dizzy, bleeding, the breath knocked out of him. He opens his eyes and sees a sloping bank of dried mud. From behind him, he hears a chirping sound. He turns. He's in the nest. The baby Tyrannosaur faces him, still in a strange aluminum foil cast on its leg. It squeaks with excitement and toddles its way towards him. Ludlow scrambles to his feet, unsure of what to do. Both adult Tyrannosaurs stand outside the nest, staring down at him. The baby runs towards Ludlow, so he turns and runs away. But in an instant, the male brings its head down, knocking Ludlow to the ground. The male closes its jaws around one of his legs, holding it tightly. Ludlow screams. It bites down ever so decisively, and the bone breaks with a dry snap. Ludlow howls in pain, unable to move, and the baby toddles forward eagerly. He can only stare as it leaps up onto his chest and opens its jaws wide. Peter Ludlow screams.
Jurassic Park.
So, the first film screenwriter, David Koepp, spoke on stage at a screening in London last Wednesday and revealed some interesting information during the event. It turns out that, originally, the plan that Koepp had in mind for the movie would have been just a tiny bit more faithful to the Michael Klayton novel. Essentially, instead of the raptor attack, where we see why Hammond's investors get so concerned, we would have seen the trip taken to the Costa Rican hospital. In the book, this is where Ed Regis would lie to the mainland doctors and tell them that one of Nublar's workers was terribly injured in a, quote, construction accident, when in reality, it was from a deadly encounter with a velociraptor. During the screening last Wednesday, Koepp had this to say about Jurassic Park. The problem I encountered, and that I still encounter today when I work with Steven, is his movies are so influential. You have a tendency to create something you think he'll like. I kind of wanted to just type for him. You have to let that go. He doesn't need acolytes. He needs collaborators. The opening scene in my first draft was at a hospital in Costa Rica where somebody's flown in on a helicopter and said it's a terrible construction accident. I wrote a really good scene where this ER doctor looks at this guy, a person who's been ripped to shreds, and says, "This is not a construction accident." Steven Spielberg responded with, "I love your opening. I can't do it though because I feel like I already did it." I said, "What? When?" He said, "Yeah, it's in Jaws." And I said, "Oh yeah, right. I love that." That's a peril. You've got to write stuff you think is great. Then he brings his stuff to it, rather than you trying to think ahead and write what you think he would want. For those of you unaware, the scene that David Koepp is talking about is when Chrissy's body is first looked over by Hooper in the 1975 movie. Once the oceanographer takes a good look at the swimmer's remains, he deduces that a great white was the one responsible for her death by saying, "This was no boat accident," which, yeah, is extremely similar to Jurassic Park's construction line. Now, most of you will probably know that Michael Klayton actually worked on the original movie and even wrote a draft of that film. You can see it in the first movie's credits. What you might not actually know, though, is that much of his draft of the movie was actually tossed out during a ton of rewrites, the last of which happened to go to David Koepp. Personally, I can understand why Spielberg felt like having this line in Jurassic Park, and the whole scene to be honest, would feel very tired if he did it in 1993. While the opening of the novel is great, and it really does help the reader visualize the gruesomeness of a raptor attack, I think actually seeing the event happen in the movie was a good substitute for the book's intro. Both are technically raptor attacks, and both do eventually lead to an investigation being carried out on the safety of Jurassic Park. So you could say that we technically got the same same thing, just told from an earlier point in that event's history. In truth, there are a ton of scenes and ideas from the 2 Jurassic Park novels that didn't make it into their film adaptations, most notably pretty much the entirety of The Lost World being a vastly different story that only bears a minor resemblance to Klayton's written work. Still, many of these unused ideas did actually pop up in the 2 new Jurassic World movies, and I'm pretty sure that we'll get to see even more of the books in the next installment. And hey, who knows, maybe this construction accident will be among them. Anyways, what do all of you guys think about this information? Do you think it was a good call to go in a different direction with Jurassic Park's opening, or do you think they should have used what they had in the novel? I'm personally fine with the change, and in fact, it kind of just results in the same thing, so I don't really think it's that big of a deal. But hey, whatever your own thoughts and opinions happen to be, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. While it's undeniably obvious that a lot of people have died in the Jurassic series, most of them have been mere drops in the bucket when compared to others who are well recognized to this very day. One such character is Ray Arnold, Jurassic Park's chief engineer. This chain-smoking technician was the complete opposite to that of his programming peer, Dennis Nedry, and worked hard on trying to undo the mess that his slovenly co-worker had put the island in during the tropical storm. A storm that was unfortunately more than just a plot point in the movie, as fate would have Hurricane Iniki hit Hawaii during the filming of Jurassic Park in 1992. This unforeseen event caused Samuel L. Jackson's character to sadly be robbed of his very intense death scene, after the engineer goes out to the maintenance shed alone, once the system has been shut down. In a recent interview with the AV Club, Jackson got to talk about his experience on the film, saying this: "I was actually supposed to go to Hawaii to shoot my death scene, but there was a hurricane that destroyed all the sets, so I didn't get to go. All you see is the residue of my body, my arm. But yeah, I was supposed to be on set." It's kind of disappointing to hear that after all this time, Ray Arnold was supposed to get a send-off in the film after he walks off-screen to go and restart Jurassic Park. Now, I searched the internet looking for any sort of outline of his death scene and what exactly was supposed to happen to him in the film version, but unfortunately, I couldn't find any real evidence on how this would have transpired. Even after reading through the Jurassic Park shooting script, I was unable to come up with any sort of indication as to how Spielberg would have shot this scene. I have, however, read the original book by Michael Klayton, who did a draft of the screenplay before David Koepp came in to do the final rewrite, and the Klayton version of Mr. Arnold's passing could give us a little more insight into how the character was supposed to go. In the novel, Arnold runs into the maintenance shed after Muldoon and Gennaro provide a diversion against a pack of snarling raptors that have gathered around the building. Once Arnold gets inside, he realizes that it's pitch black within the compound, and increasingly harder to tell where exactly he was headed. This gives Mr. Arnold the idea to take off one of his shoes and leave it in the doorway of the shed, so that a small amount of light could seep in, making it easier for him to find the generators. After doing this, John Arnold continues his descent deeper into the shed, and realizes that the generators were only 10 yards away, before the room suddenly becomes dark again. Arnold would quickly turn around to find a raptor standing in the doorway blocking the light. The animal was bent down, sniffing his recently placed shoe. Arnold started to back up slowly, paying close attention to the animal that was closing in on him. The raptor was now only 10 feet away, its claws making a deadly sound with each footstep clicking against the metal floor. It was advancing on him, but doing so slowly. The unfamiliar mechanical odors of this place had made the velociraptor cautious. Arnold glanced behind his shoulder looking for the stairs, knowing that the dinosaur would be unable to navigate its body down such a narrow and steep man-made route. He reached his hand out looking for the railing, before he successfully grabbed hold of it, and began to climb down the stairs and away from the raptor. This made the creature hiss in anger at the engineer 20 feet above him on the catwalk. "Too bad, buddy," the man said, before turning around and resuming his mission to find the generators. But Arnold would only walk a few more feet before hearing a dull thump behind him, making him turn around and stare into the eyes of the now much closer velociraptor. While Arnold had his back turned, it had actually jumped down to the concrete floor from the stairs behind them. Arnold would quickly look for a weapon before he was shoved to the ground by a powerful force that pushed its body weight into the man's chest, making it near impossible for him to breathe. Arnold began to realize that the raptor was standing on top of him, and soon felt the searing pain of a sharp claw digging into the flesh of his chest. He smelled the foul breath of the moving head above his face, and he opened his mouth to scream. Samuel L. Jackson would unfortunately never get to act out his death scene in Steven Spielberg's hit movie, and his demise would ultimately become alluded to once Dr. Sattler made the journey into the maintenance shed after he would fail to return to the emergency bunker where the others had holed up. Sattler would famously come across the severed arm of Ray Arnold once she backed up against the wall and triggered what's left of his body to fall on top of her, revealing to the audience the reason Arnold never got to cut the power back on. Apparently, a severed leg was also supposed to accompany Arnold's arm in this scene. After Ellie drops Arnold's arm from her shoulder, she was originally supposed to trip over the man's leg that would have been lying on the ground behind her. This leg was created for screen use, but isn't present in the final film, and it's actually believed by many to be the reason Ellie has a bad limp when she turns to run out of the maintenance shed. In the final cut of the film, we're sort of led to believe that the spotlight wrapped around her foot is what actually causes her to limp away from the building, but having this leg featured in the storyboards and photographic proof of its existence gives us a completely different reason for her handicap altogether. Another YouTuber actually owns the leg and the arm that were used during production of the movie, and he's actually put up a very cool video showing everyone these really cool pieces of film history. The channel's name is Jurassic Collectibles, and a link will be provided in the description of this video for you all to check out and enjoy all the awesome stuff he has to offer. As a huge fan of this series, I will say that it's kind of unfortunate that a hurricane ended up causing Jackson's death to get scrapped, but luckily we still have the storyboards and novel to kind of piece together the events that may have transpired. During pre-production on the first movie, there were many scenes from Michael Crichton's original novel that were in development for the film adaptation as well. One such scene happened to be our introduction to the baby Triceratops that Lex meets on the tour in the Jurassic Park book. Now, in the original story, this scene basically carried over the child's behavior of affectionately naming the dinosaurs, which was first introduced in the earlier baby raptor scene in the book. In the film, it was planned that Lex would give the baby trike the name Ralph, and the two would have a brief encounter in the movie where the girl rides on the back of the baby dinosaur. During construction of the various practical and animatronic effects that were being designed for the first movie, Stan Winston would begin work on the baby Triceratops that was planned to be shown on screen. An interesting idea that was being considered for this particular animatronic, though, is that this scrapped appearance actually had initially been designed with the idea of running in mind. The original plan was to repurpose an old chain-driven mechanical boar that could gallop, but later on down the line, the producers decided that all running dinosaurs would be portrayed with CGI instead of practical effects. So the focus then shifted into designing a baby Triceratops that was fully articulated, yet wouldn't have the ability to walk or run. This idea would later culminate in the creation of a 5-foot animal that was planted onto the ground. Rods would extend out from the baby's feet so that puppeteers that were underneath the stage could shift its weight from foot to foot and bring it to life. The baby Triceratops was made with full motion in its legs, tail, head, neck, and tongue. It could even contort facial movements for its eyes and lips as well. Unfortunately, after working for over a year on the animatronic, the scene would get cut from the script only 2 weeks from the trike's completion. The reason the scene was ultimately cut had to do with last-minute script decisions made late in the writing. After David Koepp had rewritten the script that Malia Scotch-Marmo had drafted, Steven Spielberg asked Malia to go over this new version of the film and give David a set of notes that could be used to refine the movie that they would ultimately end up making. And the Triceratops ride happened to be one of those things that got cut during this finalization process. Spielberg wanted to really hone in on the focus of the film's narrative and tighten the runtime to around 2 hours in length. They were always looking for cuts, and the decision on where to put this cute encounter seemed rather difficult to figure out. If they put the baby Triceratops scene before the T-Rex attack, it would slow down the movie. But if they put it after the attack, they feared the audience would question why this kid would ride a dinosaur after she'd just been attacked by one. In the end, the same sort of tone that they were going for would be incorporated into the scene where the kids feed the Brachiosaurus from a tree, which made the baby Triceratops scene rather redundant. Despite the fact that the practical effects were nearly completed, they decided to axe it completely. However, the baby Triceratops would actually get a second shot at life just a few short years later. During production on the Lost World Jurassic Park, Stan Winston's team would have to design a number of both large and small dinosaurs to be seen in cages during Nick Van Owen and Sarah Harding's stroll through the Hunter camp. The scene called for a caged mechanical baby Triceratops, and since they already had one nearly completed, they decided to just finish it up and put it in the sequel. You can see the baby briefly on screen during Van Owen's sabotage of the engine cages, and while it only made one tiny appearance, we would later get to see even more baby trikes in the following sequels to come. So even though the scene was axed way before the camera started rolling on the first film, the animatronic would make a comeback in a very short time frame. Now with all of that being said, I'm curious to hear what do all of you guys think about this older deleted concept. Do you think it would have been a good idea if they kept the scene in the movie with Lex riding the Triceratops, or do you think that what they eventually went with was good enough? Whatever your thoughts and opinions may be, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. In the first Jurassic Park novel, an extended sequence occurs in which Grant, Lex, and Tim acquire a raft and float down a river in Isla Nublar after the Tyrannosaur breaks out of its enclosure. This portion of the novel featured a lot of dinosaurs along the banks of the jungle and had the trio discover several things about Jurassic Park unknown to the people who thought they were in control of it. Notable things found on the river adventure include a camouflaging juvenile velociraptor, a couple of Dilophosaurs hooting in what was believed to be a mating display, Hypsilophodons running, as well as the unfortunate drifting next to the area in which the T-Rex had decided to sleep. This river raft sequence featured the Tyrannosaurus waking up and taking notice of Alan and the kids on the raft and even coming after the group while they advance down the river. Lex humorously taunts the Tyrannosaurus as being stupid, thinking that they are all safe as she assumes the T-Rex is incapable of swimming, to which her brother promptly puts her in her place as the animal could undoubtedly swim, and frighteningly begins to do just that. This section of the novel was actually going to be featured in the movie, and concept art was even made early on for its inclusion. However, David Koepp wrote this portion of the novel out of the screenplay because of its unnecessary need in being in the film. Once the power was out, the filmmakers wanted the island to be the definition of Malcolm's warnings, and Koepp specifically felt that the parts with the raft wouldn't work. His exact words are, "I never wanted the raft sequence. It seems to me at certain points in the book that we were being taken on an obligatory tour past every dinosaur the park had to offer. My feeling was that once the park broke down, there should be total chaos. I thought the raft trip was rather redundant, so for me, it was an easy cut to make, especially because it would have been so monstrously expensive." While this particular part of the book didn't make it into the final movie, its existence was heavily used in promotional material for Jurassic Park and the games released for the home consoles. Most notably were its inclusion in Jurassic Park and Jurassic Park Rampage Edition for the Sega Genesis. In these games, the player would take control of Alan Grant and captain their raft down a descension of several drops, dodging various dinosaurs like the Dilophosaurs, Velociraptors, Triceratops, Pteranodons, and the Tyrannosaurus itself. Rampage Edition includes a final boss portion after the river raft sequence, in which Grant must fire every ounce of ammo he saved up at the T-Rex while he attempts to make his final escape to the boat headed for the mainland. The river rafting sequence was also heavily influential to the Universal Studios Jurassic Park Adventure River ride as well, which features tourists embarking on a raft and drifting through several areas the dinosaurs inhabit once Jurassic Park's power has been compromised. Personally, I was unaware of the rafting parts of the story's existence until I read the original novel by Michael Klayton, and I honestly found the portions of this book to be very thrilling and incredibly inventive. Having the Tyrannosaurus bellow at the main characters on the bank of the river before walking into the water and beginning its hunt for Grant and the kids is a great bit of suspense and a smart way to advance the character's trek forward. Now eventually this scene was sort of retooled for Jurassic Park 3 with the Spinosaurus taking place of the Tyrannosaur, and while it was an elaborate scene with a gas tank rupture and explosion added, I still would love to see an actual raft take its flight from a stalking Tyrannosaur on the water in a future film. I understand why it was cut out of Jurassic Park, but that doesn't mean it can't be reused for a future sequel if the creators are feeling like channeling Klayton again. Now, of course, we've all come to know and love all 7 of the original species that we got to see on screen during our first trip to Isla Nublar. Whether it be the T-Rex, Triceratops, Brachiosaurs, or Velociraptor, everyone who's seen the movie can pretty much agree that each individual creature has become iconic in regards to how they were portrayed on film. Deservedly so, I might add. But it turns out that one of the very last dinosaurs that was picked for the movie happened to be a stand-in for another creature entirely. You see, back in 1992, Stan Winston Studios and the production surrounding the first Jurassic Park were busy working on all of the animatronic and practical effects dinosaurs that would appear in the film. Amongst these animals were creatures that many of us should come to expect: T-Rex, raptors, spitters, aka Dilophosaurs as they're scientifically known, and even the baby Triceratops that I recently did a video on. However, at the very bottom of this sheet depicting the status of sculptures made for Jurassic Park, a baby Hadrosaurus can be seen written in as well. Now, even though none of us saw this dinosaur in the final film, its appearance should come as no surprise to those who've read the original Michael Crichton novel, because Hadrosaurus happens to be one of the 15 species of dinosaurs that we get to see quite a few times in the first book. Possibly their most noteworthy appearance being when the Tyrannosaurus Rex chases the herd while the power is out in the park. This hunt culminates in the predatory dinosaur taking down a young Hadrosaur and killing it while the rest of the herd moves on. And as it turns out, this exact scene was actually storyboarded and conceptualized for the film early on during pre-production. Here we can see images of the T-Rex chasing down the herd of hadrosaurs, while Alan Grant and the others look on. Ultimately, the hadrosaurus was a dinosaur that was eclipsed by a much smaller and more nimble animal that Steven Spielberg felt was a better fit for his dinosaur movie. This animal would of course be the Gallimimus, which was used in place of the original creature that was shown in Klayton's first novel. Now, Gallimimus was confirmed by Paul Bangias to be the last dinosaur that was actually conceptualized and developed by the studio before the camera started rolling, with the maquette for this Hadrosaurus replacement being created sometime between February and March of 1992. One of the things that's really interesting about this dinosaur's deletion from the final product is the fact that it would have been axed just before the time the decision was made to drop all Go motion effects and move forward with ILM to render 100% computer-generated dinosaurs. Even at the bottom of one of the storyboard images, a note is made for Industrial Light and Magic to suggest that possible CGI may be used here, but only to motion blur the stop-motion animation that would already be employed to move the dinosaur. Of course, history would later be made by Dennis Muren's effects team once Spielberg decided to choose the Gallimimus over the Hadrosaurus, it turns out. Because one of the test shots that actually convinced the director to go full CGI for the running dinosaurs in the film would be this exact scene that was retooled to feature Gallimimus. Quite a rapid and interesting timeline of events, in my personal opinion. Now, all of the information that I provided for you guys comes directly from the guys over at the Behind the Gates Facebook page. If you haven't already given them a like and searched through all of the behind-the-scenes production materials that they have, then you are seriously doing yourself a disservice, because they are one of the very best places to look up all kinds of information surrounding this incredible franchise. Seriously, go check them out. You will not be disappointed, I guarantee it. And that pretty much sums it up. The Hadrosaurus dinosaur was cut from the film and replaced with the Gallimimus. Now I'm curious to know, what do all of you guys think about the Hadrosaurus deletion from the first film? Would you like to see it in a future installment, or are you of the opinion that we already have enough Hadrosaur dinosaurs as it is? Whatever your thoughts and opinions may be, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. The ending of the original Jurassic Park is one that is both iconic as well as revolutionary in its usage of real-world elements combined with computer-generated imagery in a seamless presentation of wonder and spectacle. As brilliant and amazing as this ending is, it should come to some as a shock that there were indeed several different endings to the first film that would later become scrapped and left unused in favor of the now canon finale we see in the film. One of the more interesting ideas that was abandoned by Spielberg early on was the persistence of the Tyrannosaurus to follow the humans after the initial conflict in the movie had ended, and our protagonists were attempting to flee Isla Nublar and leave it behind them. Storyboards have surfaced earlier this year depicting the final chase in which the Rex would chase Grant, Lex, and Tim to the awaiting helicopter where they would make their departure. This scene is interesting in that it depicts the Tyrannosaur actively attempting to kill the people we've been rooting for the whole movie right at the very end, and could, in my opinion, have been a great tool for building suspense. The scene opens with Grant driving a vehicle to the landing platform when his trip is cut short by the blockage of trees that contaminate the road. Grant and the kids then leave the car and begin to run on foot, hoping that the terrible beast is unable to catch up with them. Unfortunately, the Rex is high in pursuit and right on top of the trio, who are desperately running for their lives in the dense jungle. As the helicopter begins to take off, Grant hoists the children into the machine where they are helped in by the other survivors. At the very last moment, Grant is able to throw his leg upon the runner of the helicopter and hang on while they begin to lift off. At that moment, the Tyrannosaur's head would come into frame and start snapping at Grant's legs, attempting to eat him while the chopper climbed higher and higher. As the group is gaining altitude, the Rex manages to bite down on the runner of their transport and rip it loose from its hold. It then begins to pull the helicopter back down to the ground, twisting the runner and making the desperate escape even more dire. The helicopter pilot would fight with the controls and attempt to prevent a crash in such an insane situation when the Tyrannosaur would make one final lunge at the helicopter and release the runner for the pilot to make his incredible escape. They would look down upon the dinosaur and leave the island free of its torment, and the film would come to an eventual close. This finale is quite different from the initial Raptor vs. T-Rex fight we got in the final version of the film, and I'm pretty content and satisfied that they left this segment out of the movie in the end. This is a great scene and one that would totally belong in a sequel to this original film, but it also feels quite out of place and a bit too frantic for the conclusion of that first movie. The recognition and ponderance of the events that had just transpired in the film are intricate to the experience of that original adventure, and seeing John Hammond regretfully board his flight home and leave behind his precious animals is quite important and well made in my opinion. I just can't see the movie ending any other way than the silent realization that Grant has learned to care for lives lesser than his own and no longer hates children, as well as Hammond's thoughtful stare into the mosquito concealed at the tip of his cane. This is a film with an already perfect ending, and while I really do think this is great in its own right, I just wouldn't want this movie ending any other way. Speaking of that abandoned ending, had this been used in Jurassic Park, it could have radically changed the trajectory of the series in my opinion, because it involves the completion of a character arc by one person in particular that kind of alters how we view the dinosaurs and the ultimate meaning of Jurassic Park and why it's a failure as a resort in general. Anyways, the ending would have involved Alan Grant and the raptors facing off inside of the visitor center. These storyboards detail how, instead of the T-Rex being the one to kill them, Grant initially takes one out on his own, but when the other velociraptor shows up to start some chaos, it leaps into the air and is shot dead by someone off screen. The characters look at the fallen body of the raptor and then turn their attention to who shot it, and the reveal would be none other than John Hammond of all people, who showed up at the perfect time to save his grandkids and help everyone else escape. For the longest time, I've heard talk in the deep parts of the fandom about a certain deleted scene that was cut early on from The Lost World. Now, as most of y'all should know by now, The Lost World had quite a lot of scenes cut from the final version of the movie. In fact, during production, David Koepp actually produced 9 different drafts of the film in order to hone in on what exactly it was that Spielberg wanted to show to the audience. I have personally read 2, possibly 3 of these completed drafts. I can't remember exactly, but I know for a fact that I've read 2 extremely different versions of what this movie would ultimately become. For every script that I've actually found and read from start to end, none of them included this deleted scene that I've heard rumors of for a long time now, so naturally, I always assumed that it was just fan speculation and nothing more. Well, I am happy to say that I couldn't have been more wrong. What you're looking at is a maquette that was made early on during production of the second Jurassic Park movie. This would later go on to be built by Stan Winston's crew for a scene that would have actually served as the Lost World's original opening. Now, in order to give this scene a little bit of context, we need to actually go back to Klayton's second novel. You see, early on in the Lost World book, we come across the subplot that came from Jurassic Park. This was of course about all of the dinosaurs that had gotten off of the island and made it to the mainland, specifically Costa Rica. In the book, we meet back up with Martin Gutierrez, who is tagged alongside Richard Levine to go check out a carcass that had washed up on the country's beach. The carcass is later described as being from a large Ornitholestes that had a wide variety of chromatophores in its skin, which could have given it camouflage abilities. Eventually, the Costa Rican government shows up with flamethrowers and burns all of the evidence. This was to prevent the public from knowing that dinosaurs are out in the wilds of the mainland. Now, this cut portion of the second film seems to really be emulating that specific idea, albeit using the Parasaurolophus in place of the Ornitholestes. The idea was going to be that a Japanese fishing net pulled up the body of a dead dinosaur from the depths of the ocean, and word was going to get out about John Hammond's little cloning venture from Jurassic Park. InGen was going to have some explaining to do, and this parasaur was going to open the adventure that would have kicked off our first trip to Isla Sorna. During a really cool reunion with various different members of the Jurassic Park franchise's history, the crew behind The Lost World actually got to talk about this cut part of the movie, and revealed a ton of interesting stuff surrounding it.
Now if you guys go back a couple of shots, there's the one that was for the net, yeah.
There was an original opening, I don't know if we have time, but there was an original opening where the film was going to open with a dinosaur caught in a Japanese boat fishing net. Yeah, Japanese fishing trawler was going to pull up this dead carcass, and of course I got the opening sequence of the film. I was so excited, it was going to be awesome, and Spielberg wanted a shark bite taken out of it, and there was going to be crabs and seaweed hanging off of it, and then the net breaks and it falls back into the ocean. The movie starts. Got cut out of the film, but we got to build it anyway.
Ultimately, we all know that Spielberg and company would eventually go with the Compsognathus attack on the beach, which was, again, a portion taken from Michael Crichton's novels. While I do love the opening of Lost World, and I love everything about how this movie went down, I gotta say that alternate opening sounds really, really cool. If you were a kid back when these movies were big and popular, you'll no doubt remember getting really obsessed with dinosaurs and looking for all kinds of different information surrounding prehistoric animals. Well, one really well-known example of a recorded event in history that I think a lot of Jurassic Park kids used to gravitate around was the 1977 photograph of a Japanese fishing ship hauling up what appeared to be the carcass of an extinct plesiosaur. Now, of course, it probably wasn't a plesiosaur, and it could have been any sort of thing, but that image and idea of a living prehistoric animal being found by the general public really stuck with a ton of people. And personally, I wouldn't be surprised if this photograph made some sort of impact impact on the early story structure for this Jurassic Park movie. While it's relatively well known that the second film in the Jurassic Park franchise had the most deleted scenes, I think little people know of just how many different ideas were originally being tossed around for the movie before it ever even began filming. One such idea was an attack on the high-hide by the pair of Tyrannosaurs which are seen in the film. This high-hide would, however, not be the one that Eddie and Kelly use in the final product. You see, initially the production called for two versions of the high-hide, one for the Gatherers, which was going to use the Michael Klayton design from the second novel, and one for the Hunters, which was actually what was eventually taken and used by Eddie Carr in the actual movie. Story revisions eventually made the Hunter's high-hide unnecessary. With the abandoning of the Hunter's high-hide and the subsequent design change to the Gatherers, came the deletion of this action sequence, which would showcase an early rampage for the Rex family to go on in search of their missing baby. Originally, we were supposed to see Ludlow and a couple of other hunters looking out from the high-hide as the two Rexes began assaulting their site. We were going to hear a massive roar from the back of the theater while looking on at the men talking about how Malcolm had just recovered the pup. An unnamed man would race towards the high-hide while it was rising and just barely make it in time before it was out of reach. We would then get our first wide shot of the dinosaurs' attack. We'd see a large amount of hunters running in fear at the sudden surprise ambush by the animals just after all of their equipment was destroyed by the Gatherer team. This shot was going to be created by ILM with fully computer-generated Tyrannosaurs wreaking havoc on the men. One of them races at full speed toward the device while it's still climbing, before we cut away to the final shot, which was supposed to be made with Stan Winston's practical Rex animatronic, in which the animal actually catches the high-hide while it's still raising and bites around the steel cage. All of this would happen with the poor soul still struggling to get over the side while his comrades attempted to help him up. These storyboards were titled Rex's Raid and were dated for November 29th of 1995, just 2 short months after the release of Crichton's book, and a year and a half before the movie would come out in May of 1997. A popular toy was put out by Kenner for the film which happened to depict this very scene on the cover of its box. This version complete with Nick Van Owen in place of any of the hunters. Personally, I would have loved to have seen this part of the film, but I understand completely on why it was cut. You see, directly after the Gatherers' assault on the hunters was carried out, I think it was important for the filmmakers to focus on the confusion of Ludlow's group, or should I really say Roland's group, on what exactly was going on. This also helped us build suspense for the Tyrannosaurs reveal once they make their way to the trailers, and Malcolm delivers that scary line of "Mommy's very angry" just as one of the Mercedes-Benz gets shoved off of the cliff. Still, can you imagine how epic that scene would be if it was included in the actual film? It would have been incredibly suspenseful and super similar to the Must Go Faster scene from the first movie. During the Tyrannosaur attack on the Hunter camp, Dieter Stark's engine driver, Carter, wakes up most of the group by shouting hysterically at the bull T-Rex that's been lured into the camp from the blood on Sarah's jacket. Just a side note, during production, this scene would be talked about extensively in notes between Steven Spielberg and David Koepp, who thought that it could be a good idea to have Roland Tembo intentionally leave the blood on the jacket to lure in the buck, but this was never really followed up on and gone over in the final release, mainly because Roland Tembo wasn't really designed to be that much of a bad person or villain when the film actually began to materialize. Anyways, during the scene where the Tyrannosaurus attacks the Hunter camp, we see the animals split up and the story branch out into 2 paths. The first being of the female T-Rex following the hunters through a ravine, while the second detailed Roland's tranquilizing of the male Tyrannosaur. Now, if you're a big fan of The Lost World and watch it as often as I do, you may have picked up on a lot of odd things going on right here. Namely, the absence of Peter Ludlow from the main Hunter camp, as well as the fact that the scene kind of contradicts the original Jurassic Park as far as T-Rex speed goes. Remember, in the first film, we learned that these dinosaurs can reach speeds of up to 32 miles per hour, and the 93 T-Rex even chases Robert Muldoon's Jeep during what I consider to be my favorite scene in the first movie. But here in The Lost World, a full-grown Tyrannosaur that is actively trying to kill InGen hunters in order to defend both its territory and protect its family is having a really hard time of catching any of the hunters that are all running on foot. Well, there's actually a reason for that. Have you ever wondered why all of the hunters suddenly trample Carter into the ground while everyone else continues to flee? Nobody seems bothered to help him up, and the movie doesn't really explain how he got down there in the first place. Kind of odd to have just one of the hunters stumble and everyone else just run him over in the grand scheme of things, especially since a full-grown T-Rex is running behind trying and failing to catch anybody. Well, this wasn't always the case. If we go back to the actual scripts for The Lost World, and I'm actually going to be using 2 scripts here just to show you guys what really went down, we can see that when they were making the movie, the T-Rex actually did catch one of the hunters and killed him during the scene. Specifically, the InGen veterinarian, who was seen earlier on in the movie with Dr. Burke when the Pachycephalosaurus is being captured by InGen. What was originally supposed to happen can be seen in the Lost World Jurassic Park comic book by Topps, but I'm pretty sure they at least attempted to film this too, since there is behind the scenes footage of people running from the Rexes out there, and it looks very different from what's in the final cut. To quote one of the earlier scripts, "Some hunters try to leap up and scale the rocks, but the ravine is deepening. There's no way out. One Rex grabs hold of a hunter in its teeth and hurls him against the rock face. The second Rex picks up another hunter and snaps its massive head left and right quickly to break its victim's neck." Now keep in mind, this is an earlier draft of the movie that doesn't really fit with what's in the final cut, since we know that only the female Tyrannosaur ended up following the group. However, it does include the scene where the veterinarian dies, as does this piece of a different script, the final shooting script, dated for 1996. This one says the following: "The Rex picks up the hunter's veterinarian, who is trailing behind the others. The Rex snaps its massive head left and right quickly to break its victim's neck. The veterinarian goes flying towards and crashes into Carter, Dieter's driver, who stumbles and falls. The rest of the fleeing hunters run around or over him, but when the Rex catches up, it stomps right down on him, and when the Rex lifts its foot, we see Carter is actually stuck to the bottom." Now later on in the final cut of The Lost World, there actually is a scene where Peter Ludlow emerges from around the area in which Roland tranquilized the buck Rex, but he's curiously soaking wet and dripping water from his clothes after presumably jumping away from the hunters and hiding somewhere outside of the ravine. Which could lead some to believe, and I'm one of them, that maybe they cut even more out of this section of the movie in order to speed up the film's pace. But if you ever pick up a copy of The Lost World's comic book, you can actually see this scene in full, where the Rex kills both the veterinarian by, snapping his neck, throwing his body into Carter, and then him getting stepped on, in a much more violent way, by the way, than what we saw in the actual film. Kelly and Malcolm appear over the roofline with the pilots of the helicopters shouting for them to get inside. They both desperately try to make it there in time, but in a violent twist, a raptor claws its way over the edge of the building as well. Malcolm sees it as they lunge for the helicopter, but the velociraptor is far faster than both of the humans. It closes in on them, just 10 feet away, then just 5. Then surely it's about to tear into them both and kill them right at the chopper's edge. And then, all of a sudden, we were supposed to hear what's described as the loudest single gunshot that's ever been fired, while the raptor flies off its feet and lands 10 feet away, dead as a hammer. Both Kelly and Malcolm would then look up to the source of the noise and see Roland Tembo standing at the edge of the roof, holding his smoking Nitro Express before joining them in even more awesome action. This would have included scenes like Kelly breaking one of the Pteranodon's eggs on accident, and Sarah Harding further stating that the pterosaurs were only trying to protect their young. Again, something that would have hammered in that theme of parenting way more in the end. Now, personally, I have always found this scene to be awesome in design. I understand why it was cut from the film once they decided to take the Rex to San Diego instead of saving all of that stuff for Jurassic Park 3, but Roland Tembo is by far my favorite character in the entire franchise, and I just think giving him a scene like this would have been excellent to see on the big screen. In its place, we of course got the pretty great moment where Roland actually decides to stay away from InGen and even complete a character arc, which is like the only time that happens in The Lost World. So I love what they ended up doing regardless of them cutting this action scene. In truth, it would take 20 years for us to see humans actually fighting back and shooting down a dinosaur because of this deletion. Since Kelly is really the only human to have killed one of the animals, and that was through her crazy gymnastics routine. Stuff like rocket launching raptors that comes from the Michael Klayton books wouldn't be a thing until Jurassic World, which was released in 2015. The original trilogy kind of had a massive lack of that for some reason. In one of the earlier versions of The Lost World, the movie was actually supposed to end on a big surprise pteranodon attack, one that would kind of come out at the very last minute while all of the remaining survivors were still fighting off velociraptors in the worker village. At first, the filmmakers didn't really know how they wanted to execute this pteranodon attack, but they knew that they definitely wanted it to go down in the movie. At one point in time, Ajay and some of the other hunters were actually supposed to jump down from the cliff that was on the edge of the long grass where the raptors killed a whole bunch of people. There we would see them eject these elaborate parasail gliders that would help them travel down to the operations building. You can actually still see remnants of this idea in the final cut, where Roland explains how difficult it will be to, quote, climb down to the worker village.
The operations building is right down in there, about 1.5 miles from the base of these cliffs. How do you know that? I've seen it. Now the climb down won't be easy. We'll let them sleep. 1 more hour. And then we hit it.
Anyways, once those guys jumped from the cliffs, they were immediately going to be torn apart by an angry flock of pteranodons. Ajay himself getting killed in a way so bad that Sarah Harding was forced to look away. However, all of the stuff would eventually get tossed aside for a new idea in which the remaining gatherers would actually come across the pteranodons while they were trying to get away from the raptors in the actual worker village. There it would be revealed that the operations building was actually the reptiles' nesting site once they find a guano-like substance around the place. Not too dissimilar to what happens for the birdcage scene in JP3. Now of course, this version of the pteranodon ending wouldn't be anywhere near as brutal, however it would actually show us the animals for the first time in the entire film series, and in a way that genuinely feels like it would be pretty thrilling. That being said, I actually think that they made the right decision by giving this whole pteranodon scene the axe. And that's mainly because when you actually read the drafts of The Lost World that feature these things, they kind of come out of nowhere with no real build-up or suspense leading to their introduction. In other Jurassic Park movies, when an elaborate set piece with a new dinosaur attack starts to unfold, you usually will have hints or a kind of big reveal that explains to you why this animal is to be feared. In The Lost World, we don't actually see the compies hurting Kathy Bowman at the beginning, so we're left in suspense as to what really happened. But then when Dieter gets attacked, we see these little guys can be kind of terrible to people. Same thing can be said with the foreshadowing of animals like the Indominus Rex, the Indoraptor, and even the Velociraptors in the first Jurassic Park. However, these pteranodons, they just kind of show up and start being a-holes. I think it would make more sense if there was like little moments where the camera panned up to see a silhouette flying in front of the moon, or where people felt like there was something in the trees watching them while they were on their trek. But in all the drafts of The Lost World I've read with the pteranodon ending, they really do come out of nowhere. It's just suddenly there's pteranodons, and you didn't even really know they were on the island before. That being said, the producers of The Lost World were understandably afraid of Steven Spielberg's decision to cut the animals out of the movie and move everything to San Diego, where we'd get a lot of dark comedy and silly over-the-top Godzilla/King Kong tributes, complete with self-referential winks to the audience. I mean, they actually had David Koepp run towards the camera and get eaten. Jurassic Park 2 had the writer get eaten on film in the movie, and that's just one of the jokes in the whole San Diego sequence. Personally, I always liked that ending, but yeah, I will admit, it totally is a radical departure from the super serious tone that we see play out while the story was on the island. It's like watching The Ghost in the Darkness, and then all of a sudden, the ending is the baby Godzilla scene from the 1998 movie. Now, before I go any further, I want to make it absolutely clear that this is not a fan theory. This is not a speculation video whatsoever, and the stuff that I'm going to be going over here is material that was 100% planned to be shown to the audience in The Lost World during its initial production. In the past, I've done a video dedicated to why it was the T-Rex that killed the crew of the Venture, but today, we're going to be going over the evidence that shows exactly how this guy was able to do it. The information surrounding its breakout was made public after Phil Tippett auctioned off some of the Lost World storyboards a few years ago, and as soon as I saw them, I knew a lot of people would want to see how the bull Tyrannosaur got out on the deck of the ship, which is what's led to the video that I've created today. We'd start off with a profile shot of the T-Rex sedated on the deck of the SS Venture with a few crewmates working to secure the dinosaur's bonds. Nearby, a veterinarian's tent would get hit by some of the evening winds that would pass over the ocean. This would cause a lot of the vet's paperwork to fly out of his hands and into the air. It's also where we'd get our first look at the pulse monitor that's connected to the T-Rex. After the vet and his assistant chase after the paperwork, they see that most of it has flown into the face of the still sleeping dinosaur. Now we'd cut back to a shot of the pulse monitor and see that it's registering normal. We can also see here that giant bulldozer and crane mechanisms were in place to secure the cage after it had been brought onto the ship. Now we'd see the vet reach out to remove a sheet of paper that had landed on the Rex, before we'd cut back to the pulse monitor, which shows that the animal's heart is beating stronger. When the vet removes the paper, he reveals the now fully awake dinosaur, and it's not looking too happy. The pulse of the bull tyrannosaur grows stronger, but the half-asleep and totally drunk bulldozer mechanic pays it no mind. The ocean winds dampen all sounds around him, and after he realizes what's happening, he fumbles about the controls in order to prevent the animal from causing any problems. But when the mechanical arm forces the Rex's jaw to the ground, all this makes him do is break open his muzzle. Now both bulldozers work to restrain the Rex from getting out. The one in the front shoves its face down to the deck of the ship in order to keep it still. A smaller forklift nearby tries to help by joining in the struggle. The idea is to put the forks on top of the animal's midsection and stop it from moving. But a terrible miscalculation leads to the forklift accidentally stabbing the Tyrannosaur's back, drawing blood and causing extreme pain. The Rex lurches forward and roars defiantly at the bulldozer before it sinks its teeth into the vehicle's treads. This causes even more pain for the animal, but because it chose to do this, the vehicle ends up pulling the Rex further out of the cage. And that was all the dinosaur needed in order to stand up, which disintegrates the steel bars surrounding it entirely. After this takes place, I have no doubt in my mind that the scene where Peter Ludlow carries out his speech was supposed to be next, which means this abandoned concept would have been the material that was needed to further connect the San Diego sequence to the Isla Sorna portion of the film. I have absolutely no idea whether or not this was filmed by Steven Spielberg, Stan Winston, David Koepp, or any of the other people that were shooting additional scenes for Lost World during its third act. But I do know that this is the truth about how the dinosaur was able to break out of its cage and begin to kill many of the crew members aboard the ship. During the development of the second Jurassic Park movie, many different storylines and scenarios were tossed around before they landed on the narrative that we're all familiar with today. These earlier plot lines would have incorporated all kinds of different ideas that never made it into the final release. The Super Raptor, a freakish genetic abomination, was cut early on because Spielberg felt like that would lean too far into horror, and earlier drafts that followed Michael Crichton's second book more closely ended up getting discarded as well. But one of the very last things that was considered and ultimately implemented into the final film was the transition to San Diego. This was an idea Spielberg wanted in JP2 for a long time, but it actually didn't get inserted into the final script until around 3 weeks before they started filming. Now, during these late conversations on how they should do the whole dinosaur in the city sequence, David Koepp and Steven Spielberg started to come up with exciting scenarios that they believed the audience would enjoy while watching the movie. And one of these scenarios happened to be that dinosaur versus the military plot point. Now, all of the following information that I'm about to go over comes directly from Jody Duncan's book, The Making of the Lost World. Specifically, this excerpt can be found on page 74. Having set up the premise of the T-Rex in the big city, Spielberg, Koepp, and the art department began to toy with a barrage of ideas and images, some workable and some not. We tried to imagine all the things the Rex could do now that he was in an urban environment as opposed to a jungle, Lowry recalled. The Navy SEAL base is right there on Coronado Island, so there was some talk of doing a SEAL versus the dinosaurs kind of thing. Eventually, ideas had to be winnowed down to something that was dramatic but manageable, and not too silly. Okay, right now, before I go any further, I want to know how many of you think this would have been a good idea. If you're someone that's interested in seeing something like this in a Jurassic movie, let me know in the comments down below. And let me know why you think they should do this. I'm genuinely curious to hear what you have to say. So, at some point that was pretty late in the story's development, Spielberg and his team of filmmakers were thinking up ideas on how this lone T-Rex could go up against the United States Navy SEALs, and on their base, no less. The decision to back off on this idea was a really good call in my opinion. I think if they had really tried to show that T-Rex invading a United States military base, that would make for some really cool imagery, but it would realistically only last for a few minutes, if even that long. Pitting dinosaurs against humans with that kind of firepower doesn't really work in the context of Jurassic Park, as far as I'm concerned. Even back when I was reading through the Raptor comic book storyline, where the US government went into Isla Nublar in order to capture all of the animals, the imagery of a JP T-Rex going up against a tank is just way too unrealistic, no matter how they try to show it. If this scene had been implemented into the Lost World, and the military had either killed the dinosaur, or if the dinosaur somehow miraculously got away, I just don't think a lot of people would have enjoyed that very much. This film series isn't exactly the most realistic in terms of physics or actualized science, but I do think that there is a fine line that they know they should never cross. And if you're asking me, pitting Navy SEALs against a T-Rex on one of the United States bases is definitely one of those. Now, as the Lost World currently stands, once the Rex is captured, we immediately transition from Isla Sorna to the city in a pretty big shift. And from here going forward, Nick Van Owen is missing, Kelly is gone, and Ian Malcolm somehow found the time to shave his 90s action hero beard. Well, in these conversations, we can see that originally, some of that wouldn't necessarily have been identical. For starters, one of the earlier ideas for the ending would have involved Nick Van Owen and Ian Malcolm actually going to the San Diego dock in order to spoil the hunters' plans. The idea was to convince the people at Customs that there's a ship about to land that has fruits, vegetables, and animals from another country. Customs has already been bought off by InGen though, and of course none of that really matters because the ship would eventually crash into the dock anyways. Now, when the Rex actually hops off of the boat, the idea they originally had was for Ian and Nick to get very, very afraid because they knew that the Rex would immediately go after Sarah. The reason it was going to go after Sarah was because she had taken the baby. Now, to quote Steven Spielberg directly here, the filmmaker says the following: "When she gets to San Diego, Sarah has one goal in mind. I don't know how we work this out, but her goal is to get the baby Rex back and take it to safety where she can do proper work on the leg and keep it out of InGen's hands." She and Kelly do in fact get the baby, and they take it back to Sarah's condo in residential suburban San Diego at 2 a.m. to fix its leg. Sarah has no idea about the runaway container vessel and the possibility that the Rex could get out and put her and Kelly in jeopardy again. Now, another thing that Steven and David were constantly discussing around now was what to do with Roland Timbo, because as the film currently stands, he just kind of leaves after he tranquilizes the T-Rex. But for quite some time, they entertained the idea that maybe he would actually have shown up in San Diego and even went on to track the Rex in the city, only to have the animal scared away once it heard all of the police sirens that were blaring out all around it. That being said, some of the ideas for this version of the San Diego incident actually did wind up in the final film, such as the little boy waking his parents to see the T-Rex just before it eats the dog. What followed after that, however, would have involved the Rex breaking its head into the boy's room and sniffing his parents due to the boy's mother having a scream that sounded somewhat similar to the cries of its baby. They even shot this part of the movie, which you can see in still images here with Steven Spielberg's daughter, Sasha. Now, after realizing that the boy's parents weren't its baby, the Rex would retract its head and walk its way over to Sarah's neighborhood, where both she and Kelly were presently working on the infant's leg. To quote Spielberg again, this is what the director had in mind. The Rex should totally go ballistic once it looks in Sarah's window and sees the baby. Sarah could close the curtains on its face and it breaks the whole wall down, just barely missing Sarah and Kelly. They grab the baby Rex, run upstairs, and the Rex ducks into the downstairs portion of the house. In the upstairs bedroom, suddenly the whole floor bulges more. It splinters, and the Rex's head comes up through the floor. They scream, run out with the baby Rex, run down another flight of stairs, jump into the car, crash through the wall, and try to lead the Rex back to the boat. There were some other ideas about how they were going to incorporate the city environment into the movie as well, such as a pretty obvious moment of product placement where the T-Rex was going to walk past a Mercedes car dealership, and a comical group of illegal immigrants using the Rex's rampage as an attempt to sneak into America. But apart from the actual ending, it would have just involved Spielberg morgue trying to figure out how to kill Peter Ludlow. Now, one really interesting bit of writing that unfortunately didn't make it into the final film was actually planned for it, which would have been an explanation as to what happens to Nick Van Owen during the Rex rampage. And while Malcolm and Sarah were in the car trying to lure the dinosaur back to the ship, a few cop cars were thought up to not only be in chase with the animal, but also fire at it in an attempt to kill it. And after seeing this, Nick Van Owen, who was supposed to be in a second car, would actually risk his own life by using his vehicle to ram into the cops in order to push them out of the way and save the T-Rex, which would have helped explain where he was during this whole chase ordeal. In the end, of course, much of this wasn't used, and instead they went for the more meta Godzilla B-movie comedic route, which included a lot of self-referential material that you can kind of see channeled into Jurassic World during the attack on Main Street and other key action sequences from that movie. Personally, as someone who really loves The Lost World, I actually think this ending sounds like way better than what they ended up going with. I don't know if it's just because they actually explain what happened to Nick and Kelly during these events, or if it's the fact that they've actually chosen to take themselves seriously here in comparison to a lot of the King Kong jokes and other stuff that they were running with in the final cut. But there's just something about this version of events that feels way more grounded, and honestly, it feels like a thriller movie, like the island portions of the film, when I put it up against what they actually ended up making. Nevertheless, the T-Rex stomping through the city was a decision that omitted the ending that was originally intended for the film. That ending happened to depict the funeral of John Hammond, the kind old man who built Jurassic Park and sent his gatherer team to Site B in order to prevent his villainous nephew from exploiting it. This ending actually adapts some of Michael Crichton's Lost World novel for the big screen, and it also would have given us a very different closing to this big adventure. You have to remember that because Ludlow was killed back on Isla Sorna, and because his harvester team was unable to bring any of the dinosaurs to San Diego, the animal's existence is still unknown to the general public. All of Nick Van Owen's video footage of the stegosaurs and other herbivores went over the cliff with Eddie Carr's RV. Malcolm would have returned a man who was unable to clear his name, and the world would still look at him as if he's some sort of foolish scientist who's trying to con people into believing he saw real dinosaurs. John Hammond, the father of Jurassic Park, would unfortunately pass away during the events of The Lost World. His illness that we got to see at the beginning of the film happened to get the best of him, and everything he left behind would be passed down to hands very different from his own. Snow would fall on a midwinter day in a gray cemetery. A group of 50 mourners huddled around a gravesite next to a coffin. It's covered with cascades of flowers from people who've stopped to pay their respects. On a table, we see a framed photograph of the man himself. This was his funeral. A minister reads from the Bible while mourners wipe away sad tears. Ian Malcolm stands a respectful distance from the group, with Kelly right beside him. Malcolm's face is blank, tired, his sunburn out of place with the white winter setting around him. At the gravesite, a young woman turns and looks back over her shoulder. She's about 16 years old, lovely, with long blonde hair and an honest, open face. She notices Malcolm and immediately recognizes him. She nudges the young man next to her, about 13 years old. He turns and breaks into a smile, just as welcoming. As the ceremony breaks up, they walk over to him. "Hello, Lex." "Hello, Tim," Malcolm says. Lex stands on her tiptoes and gives Ian a kiss on the cheek. Tim extends his hand and waits for Malcolm to shake it. "This is Kelly, my daughter," he says after their greeting is passed. Everyone nods their hellos before Lex begins to speak. "I'm glad you came, Dr. Malcolm," she says. Malcolm replies that he's sorry about their grandfather. "We were going to call you in a few days," she continues. "Tim and I have been thinking, and we've decided we want people to know about the island. About what we all saw." Tim speaks up around now. "We think it's something Grandpa would want us to do," he adds in. Malcolm gives them both a small pause, before giving a simple response. "Why?" he asks. "Because it's all true," Lex says. Malcolm looks at her for a long moment, before speaking his mind. "I know, Lex. But even if we're the only ones who ever know, it'll still be true. You see, I've decided that if the world ever found out about what your grandfather created, it wouldn't be around for very long." Lex stops him after he's made this statement. "But it was real. You can't let people go on saying that it's not." "That's the funny thing about reality," Malcolm responds. He looks down at Kelly. "Even when people stop believing in it, It doesn't go away. Kelly smiles and takes his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. Back over Sorna, we float over the abandoned worker village, moving lightly as if in a dream. And Malcolm continues. Do you feel the cold wind blowing on your face? That's real. Do you see the four of us standing here, together, alive? That's real too. And maybe that's all that really matters. So for a very long time now, we've known that Jurassic Park 3 was originally supposed to be a very different movie. So radically different that the original cast of the film would have been playing completely different characters than what we all got to see on the big screen in 2001. Now, while we've always known that the finished product was extremely different to what they all set out to make, we never really had too much to go on or speculate about what that old version would have looked like. Well, I think, and I can't say for sure because I don't know 100% just yet, but I think I may have found something that would give us some insight into what this movie could have been. You see, I've been kind of researching and looking for any sort of shred of information that I can find in the shooting script for JP3 for some time now. And for the most part, I was never really able to get too far apart from finding out the names of some of the characters from the script that they threw out. Well, oddly enough, I think that I may have actually found some of the pages of that script that they were about to start filming. Now, I'm going to have 2 links in the description to cite where I got this information from, just in case any of you want to check it out for yourselves. But to make a long story short, the posts that contain these script pages are dated for June 10th of 2000, which would have been just a little over a year before the actual movie would be released. What's even more interesting is that after I found these 3 pages of what people are claiming to be JP3's shooting script, I found an article from IGN that was posted way back in August of 2000, so just a couple of months after these pages leaked. Now in the article, they state that Trevor Morgan, the actor that played Eric Kirby in JP3, auditioned for the role of a 12-year-old boy named Miles, and William H. Macy had also signed on to play the boy's very wealthy father, Paul Roby. For anyone who is unaware, these are the names of the Jurassic Park 3 characters that we've heard of for a long time, yet hadn't really had much else to go on to speculate any further. So I thought that this was a very interesting coincidence that I should probably bring up before talking about the pages. Now, the script in question isn't exactly action-packed, and in fact, none of the pages that I found have any living dinosaurs, but they do actually depict a scene that was supposed to play out between 3 of the film's principal characters. And what's inside of them is the following. Exterior, desert. A 12-year-old Miles Roby kneels in the desert, surprisingly poised and well-informed. Miles is currently pulling a small object about the size of a wine cork from the ground. Cooper, a sweaty, middle-aged bodyguard, crouches beside him, peering intently at the object in Miles' hand. Miles dusts off the object with a small brush. "What is it?" Cooper asks. "A tooth," Miles responds. Cooper says that he thinks it looks like a rock just before Miles explains that it's fossilized, and that it probably belonged to some hadrosaur. "A what?" Cooper asks. Miles goes on to say that it's a duck-billed dinosaur, a herbivore. You can tell by its shape. This thing was definitely made for eating plants. "So, it's old?" Cooper asks Miles. And mid-Cretaceous is his answer. The bodyguard asks what that means in English just before Miles explains that the tooth is probably 100 million years old. After hearing this, Cooper shakes his head in disbelief before calling out, "Hey, Mr. Roby, your son just found a dinosaur." Miles turns expectantly towards his father. Paul Roby, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, sits on a nearby rock. Confident and capable of charm, Roby is generally a guarded man. Right now he's talking on a cell phone and patting his brow with a handkerchief. Roby then looks over at Cooper and Miles and waves. And Miles' smile slowly fades. Cooper sees the effect on the boy. It's something he's seen before. Making the best of the situation, Cooper pats Miles on the shoulder. And finally, Paul turns to his son. "Listen, sport, we're gonna have to cut the expedition short," he tells the boy. This makes Miles' heart sink. He can't look his father in the eye. "Okay," he says to his dad. Paul says that something came up and there's nothing he can do about it. And Miles replies that he understands. But clearly, he doesn't. Regardless, Paul nods his head, smiling. He says that'll make it up to him next summer. He swears it. Again, Miles nods along, and as Paul departs, his son watches him go. Cooper picks up something off of the ground. "Hey, I just found another one of those teeth," he says to the saddened child. He hands it to Miles, but the boy barely looks at it. Cooper considers him with concern. "What do you think?" he asks. "I think it's a rock," Miles responds, before he throws both objects in the sand. Now, like I stated earlier, I cannot confirm 100% that this was the shooting script that they were going to film for Jurassic Park 3, but I can say, this is me personally, if this is a fake, it's an extremely convincing one. On the websites that I located these pages on, the original posters talk about how they had just recently proven that some other unrelated pages that they were handed were indeed an elaborate hoax. However, these pages that I've read for you guys are actually said to be pretty legit. In fact, they even go on to describe the way in which they got them, with the poster stating that Philip Newman, an aspiring actor, sent the pages to the site after he gained access to a site called Showfax. This site would usually post sides or scenes for a film that actors need to know before an audition. He later sent these sides of the JP3 script and said they were in fact the real deal. Had it not been for the fact that these characters' names line up directly with what we know about the abandoned shooting script, I wouldn't really give it much thought at all. But just the simple fact that they were posted in June of 2000, 2 months before these old names were revealed in that August interview, that really makes me look at these pages with a lot of intrigue. If this is in fact some of the stuff that was originally planned to be shot for JP3, then it would mean that the movie's character relationships were far different from what I honestly thought they would have been. I mean, here Cooper isn't a mercenary, but a bodyguard who seems to actually care about Miles or, Eric Kirby's well-being. And Paul is another absentee father that we get to see quite a lot in Spielberg-related movies. Just imagine how sad it would be for Miles to witness Cooper dying in this version of the movie if the boy actually formed some sort of relationship with him. This is really different stuff. Now for today's video, I wanted to talk about an abandoned idea from Jurassic Park 3's past that would have involved the death of a totally separate Spinosaurus. You see, one of the things that the crew originally had in mind, and something that they kind of entertained a little bit during pre-production, was the idea of more than one Spino being on the island. And what was actually going to cause the full-grown adult Spinosaurus to chase Dr. Grant and the Kirbys throughout the film was the death of its young. Now, this was just an idea that would have given the Spinosaurus a legitimate motivation to try and kill the humans on Isla Sorna during the movie's runtime, but from my understanding, it didn't really get too far into development because of everything else going on in the story.
And I do remember sort of volunteering the idea that, hey, maybe this one of the mercs kills a baby Spinosaurus, and that's what pisses off the parent Spinosaurus, and that's why it pursues them through the whole story, But you only have so much time, even though it's a 2-hour feature. There's only so much time that you have with these kind of pictures to formulate that kind of stuff into the story structure.
Now, if we just go off of what's currently available in the final version of the film, I think the idea of Cooper, Nash, or maybe someone else actually going into the jungle and either purposefully or even accidentally killing the baby Spino, which leads to the enragement of the adult, would have made for a fantastic idea for Jurassic Park 3's new antagonist. And I say this because not only does it give the creature a legitimate reason to pursue and maim the cast throughout the story, but it also kind of parallels both the Kirby search for their own son and his protection, as well as harken back to what the adult Bull Rex was doing in The Lost World, which was just trying to go out of its way to protect its infant. Now, in the end, William H. Macy explained in a 2001 interview that it's likely the Spinosaurus decided to pursue the group because their plane crashed into it when they initially landed on Sorna. In fact, if you actually pay really close attention in Jurassic Park 3, you can see that a big cut has been delivered to the Spinosaurus leg from the plane after it hits it early on in the film. Which is a fun idea in its own right, but personally, I just love the idea of the animal going out of its way to territorially antagonize Grant and the others after the unfortunate death of its young. Also, just think of what kind of interesting design and special effects we could have seen of an infant Spinosaurus had this been adopted into the final film script. We would hopefully have an entirely new creature made by Stan Winston and Industrial Light and Magic, similar to what was done on The Lost World for the Junior Tyrannosaur, and seeing the dinosaur get murked by Cooper or somebody else just makes the concept of Jurassic Park 3 and the whole parenting aspect of the story that much more interesting to me. In fact, in reality, Jurassic Park 3 changed so much during production that even the quote, final version of the screenplay that we have readily available to us is pretty different from what went down in the actual movie. Among these changes are the deadly battle between the Spinosaurus and the Raptors, the Pteranodon attack on the helicopters during the ending, and of course the permanent death of Billy himself. While all of these alternate concepts are pretty interesting in their own right, I really want to talk about how the fight between the Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus was originally supposed to go down. Mainly because it's honestly far more graphic than what they decided to keep in the final movie, and a decent length longer too. You see, during production of the third Jurassic movie, they really wanted to hammer home the idea that this Spinosaurus was the new big bad dinosaur on the block. And they planned on doing that by utterly destroying the T-Rex in a scene early on. While the final movie still depicts this quite decisively, what they had in mind was kind of really impressive. Early Stan Winston effects showcase an elaborate test with a Tyrannosaur rod puppet that was being done to sort of get a decent look at how certain scenes could be shot for the film. Link in the description for this awesome stuff will of course be provided down below. Now, at the end of the day, they actually went full CGI with the fight for the final product. But rest assured, practical effects were indeed considered and even filmed on set during production. I'll go over why they ended up not using them later on, but for now, I really want to talk about this different fight scene. What you're about to hear is from the quote, final draft of the JP3 script, and the dinosaur battle is written and described as the following. Exterior, jungle, day. Dashing back the way they came, the group suddenly comes face to face with the first monster. We now get our first unobstructed view of the gigantic creature, Spinosaurus aegypticus, over 40 feet long and 25 feet high. The dinosaur has a bony sail along its back. Its head is crocodilian, with rows of long, curving teeth. Sinewy 6-foot arms terminate in 3-finger hands with 14-inch claws. With nowhere else to run, the group scatters into the brush as the two behemoth predators rush forward. Paul and Amanda scramble in one direction while Billy and Udesky go in another. But Grant can't go anywhere. His foot is stuck between two branches. Just as he manages to free himself, the two dinosaurs approach. They'll have to deal with each other before eating the humans. Grant dives down between two fallen trees as the Spinosaurus and T-Rex circle one another like gladiators, each searching for the other's weakness. Laying flat on his back, Grant lets out a terrified gasp as the giant foot of the Spinosaurus lands across the two trunks mere inches from his face. Now the Spinosaurus lunges forward, its powerful jaws wide open, but T-Rex sidesteps the assault, its tail knocking down small trees as it spins out of the way. In the trees, Paul and Amanda scurry for better cover. Between the fallen trunks, Grant attempts to get away on his hands and knees. Now T-Rex presses the attack, slamming its tail into the flank of its adversary. Spinosaurus is knocked back by the T-Rex's tail, and Grant is again forced to duck for cover. As Spinosaurus struggles to regain its balance, the Rex dives forward again. This drives the Spino further back as the T-Rex tries to grip its throat. Amanda yanks Paul out of their path just before they make their way to Billy. Now on its side, the Spinosaurus fights back ferociously. It slashes at T-Rex with long, strong arms and razor-sharp claws. Then finally, it kicks the animal with one mammoth foot. Tyrannosaurus staggers back. It's wounded. Down below, Grant is splashed by the blood that's pouring out of the dinosaur. He slowly makes his way to his fellow humans. Now the Spinosaurus lunges for the T-Rex with gaping jaws and manages to topple the dinosaur off of its feet before sending it falling to the ground. With an earth-shattering crash, the dinosaur lands between Grant and the rest of the group. The companions scurry out of the way, but as they do, the head of the T-Rex lands almost directly on top of them. Plastered against an immense tree, the group watches in horror as T-Rex starts to rise. But it's thrown back down as Spinosaurus latches onto its throat. And then, the Spino begins to crush the life out of its adversary. T-Rex opens and closes its jaws mere inches from our terrified friends. Finally, Grant reaches the others. "Come on," he screams. All the while, the Spinosaurus lets out a victorious howl. Now, the blood-drenched professor leads the group back through the underbrush. So yeah, that was a pretty different fight from what we actually got to see. No neck snap from the Spino, and an elongated battle involving tail whips and kicks that would ultimately result in Alan Grant being covered in blood from the T-Rex just before he runs out of the jungle. Stan Winston Studios actually did a little hand puppet test early on for the more graphic nature of the Rex's death scene, in which the Spino would have choked the life out of it. But ultimately, none of this would end up getting used. Now, I mentioned earlier that they actually did manage to shoot some of the animatronic battle for the movie before canning that as well. And the reason they kind of had to do that was because during the shoot, the Spinosaurus animatronic proved to be so powerful and deadly that it actually ripped the head off of the hydraulic T-Rex on the set of the film. Needless to say, without a Rex animatronic to fight the Spinosaurus one, some of the fight had to go back to the drawing board. In all honesty, I think this fight scene does sound pretty cool, and it's something that would have given JP3 a little more harder edge than what I think it ended up with. But I can only see this elongated death scene as a louder outcry from fans that they shouldn't have emasculated the T-Rex like that. Either way, it's pretty insane to know just how different this was originally supposed to go down, and even more interesting to imagine how the public would have received something like this back in the day. So when it comes to Jurassic Park 3, I'm pretty sure all of you guys know how hectic the production of that movie was. At one point in time, they'd had plans to film where the original visitor center was. At another point, the story was going to cut away to pteranodons killing people on the mainland, and even the Spinosaurus itself was supposed to be the baryonyx originally. With that being said, there's always been one specific concept for Jurassic Park 3 that I've never really heard elaborated on too much that I personally think could have been a pretty serious scene when it comes to this older story. You see, in the final film, when Alan Grant and the others walk into the abandoned embryonics administration, we don't really get to see much outside of a few freakish fetuses and test tubes and a few shattered eggshells that are scattered around the room. Which, by the way, I have a lot of questions about, considering one of the older scripts for The Lost World states that Hurricane Clarissa hit Site B 24 months before the events of that movie, which itself is 4 years after Jurassic Park happened. So if that was really true, why was InGen still cloning dinosaurs 2 years after the Isla Nublar resort fell and John Hammond decided not to endorse the park? Well, this older mosasaur breeding tank is actually something that fans those flames a little more for me, because from the looks of it, these animals are actually fully alive and swimming around in their tank if we're to take this art at face value. There's even a man in a lab coat occupying the room with them. Now, we don't really know if this was ever something that was folded into the overall plot for Jurassic Park 3 before they threw the script out. However, I should remind you guys that during the film's production, there were a lot of rumors surrounding a, quote, underwater monster that Stan Winston may have created. Rumors at the time from Dan's JP3 page involved it either being a megalodon or possibly even a plesiosaurus, but we of course now know that none of that panned out being true. Still, out of all of the unused ideas from JP3, the idea of a fully functional lab on Site B that not only housed a breeding tank of mosasaurs, but also had InGen scientists actually residing on the island and taking care of them has always been fascinating to me. I think concept art like this and the earlier discrepancy JP3 shares with an outdated Lost World script are why people who have worked on both Jurassic World and Fallen Kingdom have opted to suggest that InGen actually did come back to Isla Sorna after the events of the second movie and ended up cloning the Spinosaurus during that time, which also explains why we didn't see that animal in the Lost World. Now, when it comes to earlier Jurassic Park ideas that unfortunately go unused, we don't usually get a lot of clarity around what their role could have been, but honestly, even if we take that info into consideration, this breeding tank has some pretty noteworthy absence in really any other part of the story that we know for a fact was planned for the movie. It could very well be a case of Ricardo Delgado just drawing something up that he thought looked cool, which of course it absolutely does, but I can't help but think that an idea like this would have made a world of difference for playing into the whole mysterious elements that the third film seemed to have. I wanted to talk about an abandoned scene from JP3 that never made it into the final film. This particular scene would have involved an entirely different set of characters, special equipment, and even action scenes that just don't exist in the finished version. Today's scene in question details a motorcycle chase where Alan Grant and the other survivors on the island would try to get away from a pack of velociraptors by revving their bikes off the edge of a cliff just before they let loose their elaborate parasailing gear in order to float away. Now, in the process of doing this, weirdly enough, one of the raptors was actually supposed to jump off of the cliff, fall onto the seat of a motorcycle while it was falling, and pretty much give the illusion that the dinosaur was literally riding the bike all the way down to its inevitable death.
Pulls the hang glider out of the backpack as a raptor jumps. I think I drew it so that raptor jumps after him, and actually the raptor lands on the saddle of the bike and takes it down to the bottom or what have you. For some reason it didn't make it in.
So this would have been a part of one of the drafts for Jurassic Park 3 that would have obviously included the students that got lost on the island, which also happened to have another unrelated scene storyboarded that involved the Spinosaurus, which we'll probably get into in a later video. But right now, in relation to the Velociraptor motorcycle chase, this is actually something that I brought to you guys a couple of years ago after learning about it. The image of Alan Grant on a motorcycle riding from raptors was almost identical to that of the iconic Owen Grady bike chase from 2015's Jurassic World. Only this storyboarded sequence reveals a lot more going on with the scene than I think any of us really would have expected. This comes from some of the early storyboards that the filmmakers were creating for the film while it was still in the developmental phase. And in fact, you can even see that they were still labeling the Spinosaurus as a baryonyx, which was the original big bad they had in mind for JP3. The scene in question happens to be a river attack that was a pretty close adaptation of the Michael Klayton novel, where Alan Grant would be paddling along with a group of kids trying to get by a sleeping dinosaur. A group of survivors would come across a sleeping Spinosaurus at some point in the story. Everyone in the raft is trying to remain quiet while Alan Grant attempts to lasso the raft somewhere else. While everyone is trying to remain calm, one of the characters begins coughing, which sends someone named Marissa to the back of the raft. Unfortunately, she accidentally places her hand over an air horn, causing everyone to look back at her in alarm and the Spino to wake up. This kicks Alan Grant into high gear and everyone else in panic mode because when that thing gets up, the animal sets its sights on them. Now what makes this scene so different from what we got in the final film is more than just simple changes from day to night. While there is an attack from a Spinosaurus to the boat in Jurassic Park 3, this version of the film would have changed that vessel to a raft. It would have featured Alan Grant attempting to sneak past the sleeping animal, and the characters are completely different here as well. This was coming from a much earlier draft of the screenplay that was playing more with the idea of the group of people that got lost on the island way before the Kirbys were ever the focus. Remember, and for those of you who may not know just yet, Jurassic Park 3 went through several revisions and had a pretty troubled production where they were making dinosaurs, building environments, and casting characters, but the script was constantly getting changed while they were even filming, so yeah, it was a big mess. And this storyboarded sequence would have been used early on to show the Spinosaurus going after a set of characters that Grant was trying to protect. Now, what I personally think makes this unused scene so cool is the fact that the storyboards go out of their way to make the Spinosaurus actually look like a pretty interesting creature here before they ever show it attacking the group. The simple animal behavior of it sleeping near a water source with what looks to be a giant rib cage of some dead animal that it has been eating on nearby, it just all sits really well with me. And I think that seeing this in the movie would have helped make the Spinosaurus look less like a monster and more like an everyday creature had it been included in the final story. Also, the added drama of Grant trying to lasso to safety is something that I think is pretty great in its own right too. One of the other things that I think makes this scene so interesting is the fact that it was envisioned with the group of characters trying to sneak past the sleeping Spinosaurus while getting to whatever destination they had in store for this draft of the script. And this has actually been an unused idea to this very day that comes from the first book where Grant, Lex, and Tim have to go by a sleeping Tyrannosaurus during the first story. It was cut from the original movie, but David Koepp's outline for The Lost World, codenamed Neptune Adventure, had a really cool revival of the scene where Dr. Ian Malcolm and the others would have had to get by them when they were getting off of Isla Sorna at the end of The Lost World. Only instead of it just being one T-Rex swimming after them in the water, it would also feature its mate trying to attack them from the shore. That's just all really cool stuff. All in all, this Spinosaurus raft attack would get changed and repurposed into the boat sequence in Jurassic Park 3 that featured the dinosaur coming up from beneath Grant and the Kirbys before attacking them at night. And I actually think that's one of the best scenes in the third Jurassic Park movie, minus all the Barney stuff of course. But I still believe this storyboarded sequence would have been way more interesting had it been the focus in the final film. And not just because I'm a fan of the Michael Crichton books, but also because of how it shows that dinosaur to actually be more animalistic in nature. We don't often get to see the Spinosaurus depicted in that kind of way from Jurassic Park, so anytime you get a chance to see it engaging with water, which we thought to be its natural environment, is a plus for me. Towards the end of Jurassic Park 3, Grant and the Kirbys are attacked by the Spinosaurus that has followed them throughout the duration of the film, and the creature is eventually defeated only when Alan Grant shoots a flare at the gasoline surrounding the animal, which causes a great fire to drive the dinosaur out of the water. This scene was adapted from the river raft portion of the original Jurassic Park novel by Michael Klayton, which featured a Tyrannosaurus instead. However, that part of the book was very different to what we'd see in this third film. Interestingly, this particular part of the movie was supposed to end in a very different way, with a battle breaking out between this antagonizing Spinosaurus and an incredibly large group of velociraptors. The scene being discussed is featured in the final shooting script for Jurassic Park 3, and its omission from the film led to another scene being created in its place. While the Spinosaurus is attacking the boat the group is in, it picks up the cage Paul Kirby has taken refuge in and throws it out of the boat, sending the man flying. The Spino then dives after its prey while Paul swims further away from the wreck in an effort to lead the creature away from his family. While this is happening, Alan directs Amanda and Eric to climb the crane we actually see in the film, while trying to evade the Spinosaur in case it comes back. When the dinosaur does return, it attempts to climb the large metal structure, but makes no progress, and instead starts ramming its head against the crane, trying to knock everyone loose from their elevated sanctuary. Grant almost sheds his bag while trying to climb higher, but instead decides to try something else. He grabs hold of the Velociraptor resonating chamber he had in this adventure, and tries to blow a call for assistance from any raptors nearby. After several tries, he finally gets the raptor's egg thief calls down, and starts blowing the call repeatedly from the device. This is the same kind of noise he heard the raptors give when they were trying to get their eggs back, and Grant thinks it's the best chance at surviving this situation. The Spinosaurus actually stops for a split second and seems confused that this sound is coming from something that isn't a velociraptor, but then continues to bash its head against the crane. Grant faintly hears a reply to his calls deep within the jungle, and soon several other raptors join in on the egg thief chorus. Suddenly, a raptor appears from the foliage and presents itself to the Spino, who doesn't even give it the wanted attention. But after this, more raptors come, followed by even more than previously seen. There are now dozens of raptors circling around the huge dinosaur. Grant decides to stop calling for help and sits amazed at the large group of predators surrounding them. The Spinosaurus roars defiantly at the raptors, and the small carnivores leap onto the creature and begin their assault. The Spinosaurus handles most of the raptors at first with relative ease, but unfortunately for the super predator, these raptors keep coming. They begin to climb up his back and slice into his hide, all the while Grant tells everyone to jump and swim for the shore. Spinosaurus shakes many of his opponents off, but these attackers have already hooked their claws into the animal and start ripping meat off from the dinosaur's bones. Finally, the Spino collapses from this savage strike by the raptors, and the smaller animals tear into him and eat their newest kill. A single raptor looks up to see Alan and the others swimming away, but decides to continue dining on the large Spinosaur instead. This scene's omittance from the film resulted in the Spinosaurus surviving its encounter with the humans in Jurassic Park 3, and simply running away from the fire that had been ignited around it while the attack occurred on film. Had this scene been included, I think a lot of people would have been really interested in seeing the fight between the raptors and this new giant beast promoted heavily in the film. However, I think it's rather illogical to have multiple raptor tribes appear quite quickly out of the jungle and then all band together to attack the dinosaur who they assume has stolen eggs. I say this because the raptor's appearance here feels rather coincidental and really quick, and it leaves me with the question as to whether all of the raptors were that close to the river attack the entire time and just paying it no attention. I can understand having a few raptors stop by after hearing the calls being made after a short period of time has passed, but having over 24 raptors show up immediately to kill the Spinosaurus on such a large island seems really forced. This is just my opinion of a scene that didn't even make it into the final cut of the film, however, and should be taken as such. They could have altered it or filmed it in a slightly different fashion to accommodate the story's action if they would have chose to include this part of the script, but as we all know, they went with the gasoline fire instead. Now, I'm curious to hear what you guys think about this cut portion of the script and if you would be interested in seeing it adapted for something else in the future. Grant's group gets trapped in a giant cage that falls in the water. Miles manages to escape and fire a flare at the dinosaur, igniting a spilled slick of gasoline. The creature retreats, but the danger's not over. Although satellite footage shows the Roby's wrecked plane on Isla Sorna, the US government chooses to send in A-10 Warthog fighter jets to wipe out the dinosaur population. Bombs are dropped, causing a dinosaur stampede, but a pilot spots Roby on a ridge and aborts the attack. After the group is saved, the mission's commander, Colonel Peters, wants to finish the job, basically going back and wiping out the dinosaurs. But Grant refuses to leave the island. He's last seen running into the jungle, recalling Spielberg's Robinson Crusoe idea. These final scenes led to the film gaining an apocalyptic new title, Jurassic Park Extinction, a name that was later rejected. The thought from the studio in my memory is that Steven agreed was that it just sounded too final, as if it was the end of the franchise, comments Joe Johnston. It was also a little misleading. Extinction for who? The dinosaurs? The human race? Alan Grant? Eventually, it was switched to something much simpler. No one was particularly fond of naming the movie Jurassic Park 3, but you all knew what that meant. Now look, I have no idea what the point of having Alan Grant left alone on the island was supposed to be, other than the fact that they could have used Grant's dinosaur cynicism in Jurassic Park 3 as some sort of character arc for him wanting to study and love the animals again after the military starts killing them off, but either way, it would have been a way different ending to the movie, and one that would have helped set up Jurassic Park 4 in a pretty interesting way. Alan Grant and Eric Kirby walk away from the boys' parents. They've managed to make it to the coast and are now waiting to see if Ellie sent anyone to their rescue. As they're walking, Grant notices something rammed up against the rocks ahead. It's a speedboat, its hull ripped open from impact. It's the same dinosaur boat that was pulling the parasail. Eric hasn't seen it yet, so Grant stops him. He asks the boy if he knows what happened to the boat that brought him here, but Eric says no, and that he couldn't see what exactly happened. "Do me a favor," Grant says. "Go back to your parents for a minute, would you?" Eric nods and heads back to Amanda and Paul while Grant pushes on. He doesn't know what he'll find, but he needs to look. And then, just before Eric reaches his parents, he turns around to see two large lights. "Mom! Dad!" he screams. They look up to see the lights forming visible shapes in the sky. Helicopters. They shout with joy, all three of them waving their arms, making as much motion as possible. Now these military choppers change direction and head straight for them. Meanwhile at the speedboat, Grant looks in, prepared to see anything in the wreckage. The cabin is surprisingly intact, just a little blood. There are 3 gashes on the driver's seat back. Grant measures their spacing with his fingers. And now Eric Kirby's voice yells over Alan. He screams, "Dr. Grant, the helicopters are here. We're safe." Grant looks down at the 3-toed tracks in the wet sand around him before saying to himself, "No, we're not." The first chopper flies by to cover the second that started to land. Suddenly a voice screams over the chopper's blades, "No, no, stay back! They're in the trees!" And sure enough, at the tree line, the upper branches start shaking. At first it looks as if it's just the wind of the chopper, until something bursts from the foliage. It's a pteranodon, and this single attacker is soon followed by 20 others. A gorgeous and terrifying sight. They all attack the chopper and smash its windows in an instant. One overeager pteranodon sticks its head up too high and gets decapitated by the blades. Soon the whole aircraft comes falling out of the sky in a huge fireball. Seeing the explosion, the second chopper takes off. Eric, Amanda, and Paul are all on board, but Grant is still running up the beach. Amanda screams out for the pilot to go back and get Grant, just before Paul pulls a lever on the inside, which releases a cord and steel ladder. Alan chases after them, catching a rung just as it goes over the water. While Grant begins to climb, a pteranodon flies up right behind him trying to bite. It catches Grant's shoulder. He spins to the far side of the ladder while the rest of the pterosaurs go to bite him as well. One of them ends up getting its head stuck between one of the rungs. Amanda looks out to see that all of the other pteranodons are returning to the island, unable to keep up. In the back, Eric and Paul get the ladder mechanism to retract, reeling Grant in faster, as well as the captive pteranodon. Just as Grant reaches the cabin, they shut off the ladder engine, but the animal is still working its way free, pulling closer and closer to the opening. Grant begins to shout over the noise, "We have to cut it! Find something sharp!" Everyone begins checking the cabin for something that will sever the line. Eric hands Dr. Grant the raptor claw he found. Grant begins to use it, but the pteranodon is still getting closer. Paul throws a wrench at the pterosaur and hits it straight in the face, slowing it down just a little. Now Grant has finished cutting one cord. He begins to go for the second, just before the pteranodon begins to snap at him. Its beak is going for his hand. There's no way he can get to the second line without taking a bite. Then Grant has an idea. He very carefully and deliberately puts his hand over the second line. Just before he pulls away at the last moment, the pteranodon itself bites through the line, causing it to fall away from the chopper just before its wings catch wind, and it turns around to glide back over Sorna. As horrifying as this creature was just one moment ago, it's suddenly beautiful again. Sitting alongside his parents, Eric speaks up now that they're away from any danger. "What do you think is going to happen to the dinosaurs?" "Population will eventually stabilize," Grant replies. "They'll adapt to fit different roles. Either that or the government will firebomb it back to the Stone Age," Paul adds in, and Amanda admits that she would most certainly support that idea. Eric looks back over the island just before he's saying, "I don't. I want to go back someday." And Dr. Grant realizes, "Yeah, so do I." Now the helicopter flies across the ocean, leaving the island far behind. Now for today's video, I wanted to talk about an attraction that was held within Jurassic World. In the fourth movie in the film series, we're given a few glimpses into what it must have been like to attend the world-renowned dinosaur theme park. Attractions such as the Cretaceous Cruise, Mosasaurus Feeding Show, and Tyrannosaur Kingdom drew in heavy crowds for Simon Masrani's lucrative business. But there were still other parts of the island that we as an audience actually didn't get to see. One of those happens to be a show that would have featured some herbivorous dinosaurs prominently, and that would be called the Packy Arena, a large coliseum-like event where the headbutters could show off their skills to an entertained group of tourists. Now, the Packy Arena is an interesting part of Jurassic World because, despite none of us actually seeing the show take place on screen, we do actually get evidence for its existence through a lot of tie-in material that was made to go alongside the movie. If you check out the Jurassic World website, or even the park brochure that came out in support of the film, you'll see that it was a heavily advertised attraction for visitors of Isla Nublar. Now that the website has been taken over by the Dinosaur Protection Group to support Fallen Kingdom, you can even see an update on the old exhibit that reads, "The Pachycephalosaurus no longer battle for sport. The enclosure has been destroyed." So, while this part of the park was open to the public, tourists would have gotten the opportunity to see the Packies butt heads with one another in a sporting contest. Early storyboards for Jurassic World even show us that, originally, we were supposed to see dinosaur handlers guiding their heads into breaking through what looks to be either wood or bricks in order to entertain the audience. We would have gotten to see this on the big screen had they stuck with their original montage idea. This is where the camera would have focused on all of the individual exhibits so that the viewer could get a feel for what a fully functional Jurassic Park would look like while operational. But that idea was scrapped early on in favor of other choices that were made during filming. However, despite us not getting a look at the Packy Arena itself in the final film, we actually do get a look at one of the animals from that part of the island during the first control room scene. When Claire Deering walks into the building to give the good news on the Indominus Rex's sponsorship, Lowry and Vivian inform her on a loose headbutter that's currently being treated by the ACU. It's here where we learn that the Packies short out their implants when they butt heads, which can lead to the animals walking through their invisible fences and free to roam other parts of the resort. In the film, they state that this was the second time this had happened that month alone, which means that ACU probably had a lot of work sedating and relocating some of the Packies after they'd been performing in the arena from time to time. Also, just a side note, this is the first time that we actually get to see what appears to be a fully grown Pachycephalosaurus in the Jurassic Park franchise. Their first appearance in the Lost World featured a rather small individual that eventually got captured by the Indian hunters. If you were a kid in the 90s and happened to be obsessed with Jurassic Park as much as I was, you probably remember being super confused at why that one Kenner toy towered over all of the other Pachycephalosaurus figures we had. Well, that's because these guys get way bigger than what we saw in the second movie, and it only took 18 years later for Jurassic World to finally show that. So, what do all of you guys think about the Packy Arena? Is this a part of Jurassic World that you personally would have been interested in seeing? I gotta say, it's a pretty cool idea, but judging by how flimsy the security systems were shown to be, and how hard of a hit Carter took in the Lost World, I'm not so sure it would be at the top of my list whenever I take a trip. Colin Trevorrow went over a lot of different ideas for attractions that were going to be incorporated into the open park. In the final film, we get to see things like the Cretaceous Cruise, the Mosasaurus Feeding Show, and even the Lost World-inspired T-Rex Kingdom. Needless to say, this up-and-running park had quite a lot of different things for visitors to do during their stay on Isla Nublar. However, not all of the initial plans actually got included in the finished product. One of the discarded ideas that was storyboarded for Jurassic World by artist Dave Lowry was an attraction known as the Plesiosaur Pond. This very different experience would have involved park guests getting inside of a small submarine that was connected to the park's extensive monorail. Underneath the water, visitors would have the opportunity to get up close and personal with a few hunting plesiosaurs and even a small group of ichthyosaurs that were being kept in the same exhibit. The sub even came with the unique ability to eject a small dose of fish into the water so they could bait the animals into coming closer to the park guests. The idea was basically for visitors to get the chance to see the animals eat and hunt as close as humanly possible, which sounds like a pretty cool idea. Unfortunately, the idea would be shelved in favor of other attractions that were a bit grander in the long run. Dave Lowry's storyboards detail the attraction being a part of an early Jurassic World montage that was going to have us view each individual exhibit once we got to the island. Other ideas like the Packy Arena and an aviary tour were also discarded once they chose to not go ahead with this opening montage. Interestingly, there still happens to be some remnants of the plesiosaur pond in the final version of the website and film itself. If we check out the holoscape that was kept inside of the Jurassic World Innovation Center, we can see a variety of different species recorded for visitors to observe. And yes, one of those species happens to be a plesiosaurus. I wouldn't call this cold hard proof that states that the theme park factually has these animals being kept somewhere on site, but I will say that their inclusion in this educational section of Jurassic World still makes the canceled pond idea and the incorporation of the reptiles as a whole very interesting. Oddly enough, Ichthyosaurus isn't included here, despite making an appearance with the Plessies in the storyboards, which makes me wonder whether or not they were cut from the film before the Plesiosaurus was. Not too much information for me to really speculate on that matter, but personally, I've always wanted to see the Plesiosaurs make an appearance in a Jurassic movie for a very long time now. In fact, after Jurassic Park 3 had come and gone, I had thought that the next film in the series would have focused more on aquatic animals in a large deep blue sea style research lab that was kept underwater, kind of like what we eventually got to see in Telltale's Jurassic Park the game. I guess after seeing flying reptiles, my mind immediately jumped to seeing aquatic ones in the early 2000s. Looking back, Dino Crisis 2 probably didn't help me get rid of that idea. After the film's initial release, one of the most talked about scenes from the movie has to have been Zara's death scene. As soon as Claire's assistant was lifted into the air by a pteranodon, we all knew this wasn't going to end well for her. What resulted was a pretty big controversy surrounding the Mosasaurus killing this woman, with some detractors calling the scene too violent and undeserved for a character that hadn't, quote, earned her comeuppance earlier in the plot. Personally, I've always liked the scene and never understood the criticisms. However, I do wonder what people would have said if this part of the movie played out differently. Well, interestingly, I've happened to come across an early version of the Mosasaurus attack sequence that would have been radically different. I found this early version of the attack through some of Dave Lowry's awesome storyboards, which are seriously incredible by the way. Link to his website will of course be provided down in the description below. You guys have to check his work out. Now to cut to the chase and go ahead and talk about the scene, it looks like this version of Jurassic World would have included a main character that was going by the name of Evan. I'm going to assume this is a prototype version of Owen Grady after they canned the Vance role from the Joffin Silver script, but still before a lot of the other stuff that got finalized in the film itself. Anyways, Evan happens to reach out to some unnamed tourist who's presently in danger of falling off of the monorail and into the Mosasaurus lagoon many feet below. Just as Evan grabs hold of the tourists, a large shadow casts itself over their bodies, and the two turn to see a hungry pteranodon taking advantage of the situation. The pterosaur nips at their bodies before grabbing the man by his leg, with Evan still holding on for dear life. A rescue team on jet skis and motorboats starts to come en route to save the people in peril, but it doesn't look like they're gonna make it in time. Back to the unnamed tourist perspective, we get the terrifying image of the mosasaur rising up from the depths to chomp down on the pteranodon just as it had done countless times earlier with the great whites. After latching onto the reptile's feet, the mosasaurs would try to tear the animal away from the man's leg, with Evan still holding on in a desperate attempt to save him. This pteranodon wouldn't have to hold on for too long though, because the cavalry seems to have arrived just in time. The rest of the pterosaur's flock would soon flap their wings over to the sea beast and begin to peck and scratch at the creature in order to save their own. The mosasaur lets itself sink into the water in order to get away, and we get the perspective of a shocked couple that's looking on in disbelief at the chaos that's playing out behind the glass of their underwater observatory. Now, the rescue team has finally gotten close to the wild carnage that's taken place, and the pteranodon lets go just as they arrive. After Evan lifts the tourists up and away from danger, we see the rescue team use what looks to be the same long taser sticks that were used by Hammond and Lockwood in Jurassic Park and Fallen Kingdom respectively. They stab and shock the pteranodons and even the body of the mosasaurus in an effort to drive the animals away from the park guests. This unfortunately just leads to the reptile diving down and getting away with its prey while the other flyers look on in anger. Now the creature had gone deep enough to where there simply was nothing more that they could do. So this scene was originally constructed in a radically different way to what we saw on the big screen. The very idea of a mosasaurus latching onto a pteranodon that's latching onto a man's leg who's being held up by another man seems pretty bonkers and downright insane in my honest opinion. Most of the Jurassic Park movies have a lot of deleted scenes. From what I've heard, the first movie has around 12 minutes of cut footage. Both The Lost World and Fallen Kingdom have around or more than 30 minutes or so, and who knows what got left on the cutting room floor for JP3. That being said, we really don't get to see too many of these scenes once the film comes out, and even after they hit home media release. There are tons of Jurassic scenes locked away in vaults somewhere in Universal that we more than likely just aren't really ever going to get to see. And almost as numerous as all of these deleted scenes are, there happens to be a ton of deleted concepts as well. Now, Jurassic World is no exemption to this historical trend. When it comes to the JP movies, a ton of scenes are choreographed, conceptualized, tested, and rendered before the director even yells action on set. And one particular scene that depicted the Indominus was deemed to be something that could have been interpreted as being in poor taste had it actually been filmed. You see, towards the end of the movie, once nighttime had fallen over Isla Nublar and the Indominus had caused a lot of trouble, there was going to be an altercation between this genetic hybrid and an animatronic T-Rex that would pop out of a man-made waterfall. This robotic Rex was built for visitors of the theme park to look up at and appreciate while they were on their vacations at Jurassic World. But once the Indominus got a good glimpse at it, she was going to lash out at the mechanical dinosaur and rip its head off with her powerful jaws. So the reason this scene was scrapped early on actually has nothing to do with pacing, runtime, or violence. In fact, it was actually selected for extinction in fear of what the audience may think that it subtextually means. During production on Jurassic World, Colin Trevorrow would often welcome Steven Spielberg on set and behind the scenes to check out exactly how the fourth film was coming along. This is after Spielberg's long run of producing in the 1980s with films like The Goonies, Gremlins, and the Back to the Future trilogy. In the modern age, though, the director has stated that he really doesn't like to pop his head into movies that he produces for fear of butting heads with the directors on those individual films. This is why you see Steven Spielberg's name on big-budget projects like the Transformers series, even though he honestly has very little involvement. The Jurassic World trilogy, however, is noticeably different. As stated before, Trevorrow would often ask Spielberg to come visit and go over everything that they're currently doing personally. And even in Fallen Kingdom, a lot of the decisions for taking the dinosaurs to California instead of England were done because of Spielberg himself. So, one fateful day, the veteran director arrived to check out some of the conceptualized scenes, saw the Indominus rip the head off of an animatronic T-Rex, and immediately advised Trevorrow to reconsider the scene entirely. In today's day and age, people can get easily outraged and kind of angry at something quite trivial, and Spielberg knew that this was probably a contender for that. His concerns were that as soon as some random person saw this in the theater, they'd immediately attack Jurassic World and claim that this scene was implying that CGI was superior to practical effects. And since Jurassic World did happen to have a pretty noticeable over-reliance on CGI, it probably wouldn't look good for the movie in the long run. So Trevorrow sided with Spielberg, got rid of the concept, and continued making the film effective immediately. For those of us that have seen the final version of Fallen Kingdom, we all know that the Mosasaurus was released by a few mercs and a guy with access to the reptile's lagoon at the beginning of the film. The opening Bayona chose to incorporate relied heavily on the Tyrannosaurus for suspense, while the Mosasaurus made 3 notable kills for dramatic effect. Well, originally, we'd have to add a whale or two to that body count. It looks like the Mosasaurus would have been following a pod of whales during an interesting whaling sequence. The whalers would shoot their harpoons into the side of one of the mammals just before the massive Mosa would bite into the unsuspecting creature and leap out of the water and possibly even over the entire ship if this storyboard is to be taken realistically. Kind of a dark twist on Free Willy. And from there, it actually looks like the Mosasaurus would either kill a few of the men on board the vessel or possibly do battle with the boat before we got the title card. From what I can gather, this would probably have led to the meeting Ian Malcolm had with Congress before we meet back up with Claire Dearing and her new dinosaur protection group. That being said, in my opinion, this would have been an extremely effective opening, and it would definitely give us something that we've never seen before, although, personally, I think I prefer the Tyrannosaurus attack on the helicopter over what's shown here. To me, Fallen Kingdom easily has the greatest opening out of the entire Jurassic Park franchise, and it's the incorporation of so many masterfully directed dinosaur sequences and beautiful cinematography that make it the effective intro that it is. Now, I think we need to start this discussion with an acknowledgement of the petition that actually reached Trevorrow. Fans that were pretty upset with how the fight in JP3 went down have been very vocal about having the T-Rex eventually come back and absolutely destroy the Spinosaurus for a number of reasons, some of which are actually paleontologically based, which is kinda admirable. With the T-Rex having the most devastating bite force of all terrestrial animals, meaning the baddest and most factually destructive bite from any creature that lived on land, you'd think that bite in the neck of the Spino would have spelled certain doom for the new creature, but we all know that didn't happen. And because the Rex lost the fight like that, this series has had a number of things change within it years after. Most interesting of which, in my opinion, was the very existence of Jurassic World, a movie which went out of its way to provide the audience with substance and subtext on how making a bigger, badder dinosaur for the sake of being bigger and badder could destroy what's come before. I really liked that message, and it was enough for me to let go of most of my displeasures with JP3 and kinda just accept the movie for what it was. Others didn't really share my sentiments though, which of course leads us to the production of Fallen Kingdom. Now, I've heard very little of what actually was going to happen during this rematch, but I'll go ahead and tell you everything I understand about it as of now. You know that scene where Rexy takes out the Carnotaurus and does that loud bellow in front of that awesome wide shot of the volcano? That's a really good shot. Well, originally, that Carno was supposed to be the Spino after the fight. Apparently, all of the dinosaurs would run away from the volcano during its eruption, except for a couple of stragglers who were falling behind. This was going to be the Spinosaurus and Tyrannosaurus, who couldn't stop snapping at each other during the big dinosaur exodus scene. Eventually, the two of them couldn't take it anymore because they just flat out hated each other so much. So they would have stopped right where the gyrosphere was to give us a huge standoff and eventually engage in a massive dinosaur fight, during which Rexy was going to annihilate the Spino and the movie would presumably continue the way we saw it on film. Now, to tell you the truth, I don't know if I would have loved this scene or thought it was a little too much, but Trevorrow and Bayona definitely thought it was more of the latter. That's why they decided to just have the Carnotaurus attack the Sinoceratops before it gets put down by Rexy. I know that the idea behind the new fight was meant to portray how beat up and malnourished the animals were since they weren't being taken care of after Jurassic World fell, and ILM has stated that this is why most of them look sickly and pale, but I just keep thinking about seeing the Spinosaurus again on the big screen and how much of a smile it would have brought to my face. And this is coming from a fan that holds JP3 as his least favorite. Surely some of the fans that love that movie would have gotten a kick out of it. But alas, that scene was altered and the Spinosaurus has yet to return. Anyways, the Spinosaurus and T-Rex fight would undergo a minimum of 7 iterations before the filmmakers landed on what we see in the final release. There might actually be even more, but as far as I'm aware of, up to 6 is what has actually been released to the public. That 6th version, by the way, can actually be seen in these awesome storyboards from David Alcock, who was visualizing the movie back when Franklin's name was actually Clay, believe it or not. Interestingly, in this version of the fight, the Carnotaurus actually wins against a Pachyrhinosaurus, which would later have its name changed to Sinoceratops much later on in production. During the fight, the Carno is able to push the herbivore onto its side before delivering a killing blow to its throat and tearing out a large chunk of bloody flesh. Of course, that wouldn't be enough turmoil for our heroes though, because another predator happened to be on the lookout for an easy meal during all of this wild chaos. Now, in my opinion, the final fight in the movie is pretty good, but a rematch between the T-Rex and Spinosaurus would have also been pretty cool to see, especially since there is some evidence of the Spino being present at the auction in some children's coloring books and other media that came out around Fallen Kingdom's release. So I guess even though the T-Rex beat the Spino, it probably wouldn't have killed it. While talking to Collider, J.A. Bayona was asked if there were any scenes featuring dinosaurs that just missed the final cut of the movie, and the director revealed the deleted scene that would have featured this classic dino in action on the island. He didn't really elaborate on what exactly happened during that scene, so it's kind of hard to tell what it would have looked like. In fact, the only real use of the Dilophosaurus for Fallen Kingdom outside of the film has been the short LEGO Jurassic World interactive game that featured a really big spitter breaking into an old compound and attacking Owen. Since Owen isn't around any place like that during the volcanic eruption in the movie at all, I'm going to assume that it's not the deleted scene Bayona was talking about, but I do find it rather interesting nonetheless. It sort of surprises me to know that the Dilophosaurus has yet again been snubbed from a Jurassic movie, but if I'm being totally honest with you, I was already really happy to get the animal's faint hoot and quick movement in the opening of the film. Technically, if we're being really analytical here, Fallen Kingdom does have a Dilophosaurus in it because of this scene. But of course what people really want to see is another attack sequence featuring that venomous creature. Now, Bayona states that they cut the Dilo from the film because the movie was getting a little too long. And due to the fact that the original cut was somewhere around 2 hours and 45 minutes, I can understand why he felt like it went on for a bit too long. That being said, I know every fan out there would love to see these deleted scenes in all their glory in the special features of the DVD or Blu-ray. Unfortunately, that just isn't going to be the case with this explosive sequel. After revealing that nothing meaningful to the plot or really important to what actually progresses the film's story was cut, everyone decided that they didn't want to include any of these cut scenes on the home media releases of the film. A bummer, but we've only gotten deleted scenes for 2 of the 4 previous films, so I kind of expected this. Now, even though this Dilophosaurus scene was cut from the film for length, we do get to see the taxidermied body of one of the animals on display facing off with a stuffed tiger-striped male velociraptor during the later mansion scenes. In my opinion, the inclusion of this particular image in the movie, as well as the scene in Jurassic World that featured Delta attacking the hologram of a Dilophosaurus, suggests that we could very well get to see some sort of raptor versus Dilo fight in the future. Hopefully we can see it happen in Jurassic World 3, but who knows what may be in store for that film. This particular image is from a very early point in pre-production where the story would have played with the idea of having 2 Indoraptors. These animals would eventually begin to fight one another, and the black one we see in the final version would kill its white sibling. This of course was never shot, seeing as it was a scrapped idea from way back at the start of the movie's inception, and to be honest with you, I'm kinda glad they cut it. Now hear me out. It sounds like an awesome idea, but in my opinion, it would direct a lot of criticism towards the fact that it would essentially be compared to the story point in Jurassic World, where we get information that the Indominus Rex killed its other sister. And apart from that, I don't really think it would have added anything to the overall story, so although this looks awesome, I think they made the right decision in leaving the concept behind. Now before I go, I want to thank everyone that's helped me build my channel over the years. I'd also like to thank every one of you guys who've watched my stuff. You've all been extremely cool to me. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate a like and hope that you'll consider subscribing. God bless you all, Christ is King, see you guys in the next video, and as always, take it easy.